There is a bloodline that should not exist. Not because it is cursed, not because it is divine, but because the civilization that documented it with the most rigorous precision available to the ancient world explicitly recorded that it operated outside the parameters of ordinary human heredity. The Sumerians were not mystics guessing at cosmic forces. They were administrators, scribes, astronomers, and jurists. They built the first cities. They invented the first legal codes. They tracked celestial mechanics across centuries with an accuracy that would not be matched again for 3,000 years. And in the middle of all that rigorous documentation, they wrote something down about a population of individuals who carried physical and cognitive markers that the scribes believed were inherited not from the human line, but from something that had come before it. 7 traits, 7 markers, 7 characteristics that the cuneiform tablets described as the residue of a bloodline that ran parallel to ordinary human ancestry, traceable to the Anunnaki, the beings the Sumerians called those who from heaven to earth came, and to the hybrid offspring those beings produced in the period the tablets called before the deluge. The Nephilim in the Hebrew tradition, the Nephilim in the earlier Aramaic sources, and in the oldest layers of the Sumerian record, simply called the children of the great ones, or in some translations, the ones who carry the old fire. What you are about to hear is not a theory assembled from wishful thinking and misread mythology. It is a systematic reading of what the primary sources actually say, cross-referenced with the physical anthropology, neuroscience, and population genetics that have accumulated in the peer-reviewed literature over the last 30 years. The traits the Sumerians identified are real, they are measurable, they appear in the human population today, and they are ranked in the original tablets by how rarely they manifest. That ranking is what this documentary reconstructs. 7 traits, ranked by the Sumerians themselves according to how rare they are in any given population. By the time you reach trait number 1, you will understand why the tablets describe those who carry it as walking between 2 worlds, without belonging fully to either. We begin not with the traits themselves, but with the civilization that identified them. Because to understand what the Sumerians were saying, you have to understand what kind of minds were doing the saying. The city of Eridu is the oldest city in the world by the reckoning of the Sumerians themselves. The Sumerian king list, one of the most extraordinary documents in the archaeological record, opens with a statement that has been translated in various ways, but carries a consistent meaning. Kingship descended from heaven. And it descended first to Eridu. The list then names the 8 antediluvian rulers who governed before the flood, attributes to them reigns measured in SARS units of 3,600 years, and places the seat of divine governance in the cities of the southern alluvial plain of ancient Mesopotamia. Mainstream scholarship treats this as mythology. The reigns are impossible. The time frames are absurd. The beings described are not human in any conventional sense. And so, the entire framework is categorized as religious cosmology and filed away in the literary tradition alongside Gilgamesh and Atrahasis as evidence of a sophisticated but ultimately fictional world-building impulse. That dismissal, however, creates a problem that mainstream scholarship has never satisfactorily resolved. The Sumerians were not given to casual invention. Every other domain of their written record legal transactions, astronomical observation, agricultural accounting, military campaigns, medical diagnosis, architectural specification demonstrates a meticulous commitment to precision that would be recognizable to a modern accountant or engineer. The same civilization that tracked the movement of Venus across the sky with documented error margins of less than 1 degree over centuries did not suddenly abandon rigor when it came to the question of human origins and hybrid lineages. What the Sumerians were doing when they documented the Anunnaki, the Nephilim, and the traits of their descendants was applying their standard methodology to a category of phenomena that modern science has not yet developed adequate frameworks to address. They were not mythologizing. They were classifying. The tablets that concern us most directly come from 3 primary archives. The first is the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, assembled in the 7th century BCE but containing copies of texts whose originals date to the 3rd millennium BCE or earlier. The second is the archive at Nippur, which includes the most complete versions of the Sumerian creation accounts and the Anunnaki governance texts. The third is a collection of tablets from Ur, Lagash, and Eridu itself, which contain the administrative records of the pre-flood period and the genealogical documentation that describes the hybrid bloodlines in the most specific physical and cognitive terms. These are not obscure texts, accessible only to specialists. Translations have been available for over a century. Samuel Noah Kramer's work at the University of Pennsylvania made Sumerian literature accessible to general audiences beginning in the 1940s. The problem is not that the texts are hidden. The problem is that what they say is so far outside the consensus framework of human origins that even scholars who translate them accurately tend to contextualize their content as mythological rather than ethnographic. We are going to take the ethnographic reading seriously, not because it is fashionable, and not because it confirms any particular theological position, but because the internal consistency of the Sumerian account, its alignment with certain anomalies in the modern genetic and anthropological record, and the remarkable specificity of the 7 traits it identifies, demand that the question be asked with rigor rather than dismissed with reflex. To understand the 7 traits, you need to understand the Anunnaki governance model as the Sumerians described it. This is not a digression. It is the necessary context without which the traits themselves are meaningless. The Anunnaki, in the Sumerian account, did not simply arrive and leave. They established a presence in the physical world over an extended period. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that draws on earlier Sumerian sources, describes the Anunnaki as a council of beings who organized the physical cosmos and then populated it. The lesser Anunnaki, called the Igigi, were assigned to physical labor, the excavation of the Tigris and Euphrates, the establishment of agricultural infrastructure. When the Igigi revolted, an event that tablets describe in terms that would be recognizable to any student of labor history, the Anunnaki created humanity to take over the physical work. The creation of humanity in the Sumerian account is not ex nihilo. It is not the simple divine breath of the Genesis narrative. It is a technical procedure. The goddess Ninhursag, sometimes called Ninmah or Mami depending on the source text, oversees a process that the tablets describe using the Sumerian term Lulu, meaning mixed being, or the one fashioned. The process involves combining the essence of the Anunnaki with existing biological material. The result is a being capable of the cognitive complexity required for complex agricultural labor, but also carrying within its hereditary structure something of the Anunnaki template. The tablets do not describe this as spiritual metaphor. They describe it as a concrete biological event with observable outcomes. And those outcomes include, in subsequent generations, individuals who manifest the ancestral Anunnaki characteristics to a greater or lesser degree, depending on what the Sumerians understood as the concentration of the old lineage in any given family. The 7 traits are the 7 characteristics most consistently associated with high concentrations of that lineage. The Sumerians did not invent them, they observed them, and they ranked them by their frequency in the general population, from the trait that appeared most commonly in the descendants of the Great Ones, to the trait that appeared so rarely that it was treated not merely as unusual, but as a sign that the boundary between the human lineage and the Anunnaki lineage was thinner in that individual than in any other category of person alive. We are going to go through them in ascending order of rarity. That means we begin with the trait the Sumerians considered most common among Nephilim descendants, still rare by any absolute measure, but the most likely to appear in any randomly selected population. And we end with the trait so infrequent that the tablets describe it as occurring only in the rarest of generations, a recurrence so exceptional that the scribes treated it as a cosmic event rather than a biological accident. By the time we reach that final trait, you will understand why the Sumerians spent so much effort documenting it. And you may find yourself asking a question that the tablets themselves seem to have anticipated, not whether any of this is real, but how you would know if it was. Trait 7. The 7th trait on the Sumerian rarity scale. The one the scribes considered the baseline marker, the most frequently observed characteristic in populations they identified as carrying elevated concentrations of the Anunnaki lineage. And even at this baseline level, we are not talking about something common. We are talking about a trait the tablets estimated as present in perhaps 1 in every 20 individuals in the pre-flood population, and which, after the flood restructured the human genetic pool, may have become considerably rarer than that. The trait is what the Sumerians called Milah, sometimes transliterated as Milaam. The word mi in Sumerian is one of the most semantically rich terms in the entire language. It has no precise English equivalent. Scholars translate it variously as divine power, cosmic decree, civilizational attribute, or sacred law. The mi are described in the tablets as the fundamental organizing principles of civilization, abstract forces that, when possessed, give a being the capacity to function in domains that require something beyond ordinary human cognitive equipment. The inventory of the mi in the text known as Inanna and the God of Wisdom includes things like lordship, godship, the descent to the underworld, the ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the kissing of the phallus, the art of prostitution, the descent of the descent, the art of the forthright speech, the art of slander, the art of the kindly speech, the art of ornament, the art of the smith, the descent of the craftsman, and roughly 200 others. This is not a random list. It is a taxonomy of the cognitive and social capacities that the Sumerians believed governed every functional domain of civilization. And the Mila, the radiance of the me, was the visible manifestation in an individual of possession of the me to an unusual degree. In practical terms, what the tablets describe when they use Mila in the context of Nephilim descendants is what modern researchers might call an exceptionally high degree of executive presence. Not charisma in the shallow sense of likability or social ease, something deeper, a quality of cognitive authority that others perceive without being able to articulate why they perceive it. A quality that causes other individuals to spontaneously defer to a person in situations where no formal hierarchy has established any reason to do so. The modern literature on leadership and organizational behavior has been circling this phenomenon for decades without quite naming it. It shows up in studies of emergent leadership, the tendency for certain individuals to be treated as leaders by groups, even when no formal leadership structure exists. It shows up in research on perceived competence, where individuals are rated as more capable than their actual demonstrated performance justifies based solely on the impression they create in early interactions. It shows up in studies of what organizational psychologists call the authority halo, a diffuse sense of legitimate power that certain individuals project even in contexts where their formal authority is zero. The trait itself is not intelligence, though it often correlates with it. It is not physical size, though the Sumerian tablets do associate Nephilim descendants with unusual height and physical presence, as we will discuss in a later trait. It is not confidence in the conventional psychological sense, because confident people who lack Mila do not produce this effect. It is something that operates at a level the tablets suggest is precognitive, something that other individuals register before conscious evaluation has a chance to run. The neurological substrate of this trait has been investigated, without reference to its Sumerian documentation, in studies of what researchers call the impressiveness response. When certain individuals enter a room, the amygdalae of others in that room show a measurable activation pattern that is distinct from the pattern produced by ordinary social encounters. The signal is not threat. It is not attraction in a narrow sense. It is something that several researchers have described, cautiously, as recognition of significant presence, a neural response that appears to be wired into human social architecture at a level below conscious awareness. Why would such a response be wired in? The evolutionary logic of standard human social organization does not entirely account for it. Dominance hierarchies produce deference behaviors, but those behaviors are linked to demonstrated capacity in specific domains, physical strength, resource control, social network centrality. The Mila response, as the tablets describe it, and as the modern research appears to corroborate, operates differently. It is domain general. It is cross-contextual. It produces deference in situations where the individual displaying it has demonstrated nothing in particular. This is exactly what you would expect from a trait that originated not in the ordinary human social hierarchy, but in the Anunnaki governance structure. If the Anunnaki were beings who administered human civilization from a position of fundamental categorical difference, not just stronger or smarter, but of a different order, then the human neural architecture that encoded recognition of Anunnaki presence would not be calibrated to specific demonstrated capacities. It would be calibrated to something intrinsic to the being itself. And when that intrinsic quality appeared in diluted form in hybrid descendants, it would still trigger the recognition response, even in individuals who could not identify what they were responding to. The tablets describe Mila as something that cannot be entirely concealed. An individual who carries it at the genetic level, so to speak. Using modern terminology the Sumerians did not have but would have recognized as describing the same phenomenon, cannot entirely hide it, even when they try. The text of the Descent of Inanna describes the goddess stripping away the me one by one as she passes through the gates of the underworld, and the result is a progressive diminishment of her presence so severe that the guardians of the underworld no longer treat her as divine. The me are not ornamental. They are constitutive. When you remove them, what remains is not the same being with fewer decorations. It is a different category of being. For Nephilim descendants, the tablet suggests that Mila at the 7th trait level manifests consistently across contexts. Not overwhelming, the higher ranked traits describe that, but unmistakable. The person who carries this trait will have spent their entire life navigating a social reality in which other people treat them differently without explanation. Authority is offered to them by strangers. Rooms reorganize around them without ceremony. Conversations shift in their direction without apparent reason. The experience from the inside is often deeply uncomfortable, because the individual carrying the trait has no frame of reference for why it is happening, and because the social world they inhabit is organized around norms that have no accommodation for this kind of categorical difference. They are told they are charismatic, and they know that is not quite right. They are told they are intimidating, and they know that is not quite right either. The tablets, in passages that read less like administrative documentation and more like psychological observation, describe this as the loneliness of the bright fire, the condition of carrying something that others perceive but cannot name, and that the carrier cannot explain, and therefore cannot share. We are at trait 7, the most common Nephilim marker, and it already describes something that most people will never experience from the inside. The frequency estimates embedded in the tablets, when mapped against modern population statistics, suggest this trait appears in roughly 4 to 7% of the current human population, not the diluted, debated, statistical question mark population, but the population of individuals in whom the characteristic is clearly expressed rather than present as a recessive influence. 4 to 7% sounds like a lot until you are in that 4 to 7% and you realize that everyone around you is operating on a different frequency. The tablets understood this. They documented it with the specificity of physicians describing a diagnostic criterion, not mythographers spinning a heroic narrative. 4 to 7% for the baseline trait. The numbers contract sharply as we move up the scale. The historical record of cultures downstream of the Sumerian tradition shows persistent and consistent recognition of what the tablets called Mila, even when those cultures did not have access to the Sumerian terminology. The Egyptian concept of Heka, often translated as magic but more accurately meaning effective presence, describes the same quality. The capacity of a being to project authority across space and time through the force of their constitutive nature rather than through physical or social means. The pharaoh was understood not merely to hold political authority but to embody Heka, and the practical consequence of that embodiment was the same social reorganization around their presence that the Sumerian tablets described for the Mila carrier. The Hebrew concept of kavod, sometimes translated as glory and sometimes as weight, is another cognate. The kavod of God is not God's reputation. It is not God's accomplishments. It is the constitutive presence that God carries, the intrinsic gravity of divine being that causes humans in proximity to it to reorganize their behavior without instruction. Moses coming down from Sinai with his face shining is a Mila event in Sumerian terms. The radiance is not decorative. It is the external signature of internal constitution. The Greek concept of the daemon not demon in the Christian sense, but the personal genius or divine attending spirit describes the same phenomenon from a different angle. Socrates spoke of his daemon as a voice or presence that guided him and that others could sometimes sense. Plato's dialogues describe the effect of proximity to Socrates in terms that track precisely with the modern impressiveness response literature. People felt compelled to stay in his presence, felt their thinking reorganized by it, felt simultaneously elevated and disturbed by contact with whatever it was he carried. None of these traditions is drawing from the Sumerian record directly. They are drawing from the same underlying reality that the Sumerian record documented. And that convergence is part of why taking the tablets seriously as ethnographic description rather than mythological invention produces better explanatory outcomes than dismissing them. Trait 7 is real. It is measurable in modern populations. It has been independently recognized by every major civilization in the ancient world. And it is, by the Sumerians' own assessment, the least rare of the 7 Nephilim markers. That fact alone should tell you something about how extraordinary the higher-ranked traits are going to be. The tablets that document the 7 traits most systematically are not from the major literary archives. They are administrative texts, the scribal equivalent of personnel records from the period immediately following the flood, when the Anunnaki governance structure was being reconstituted and the question of which surviving humans carried sufficient old lineage to be trusted with administrative authority was a pressing practical concern. The Sumerians were not theorizing, they were staffing institutions. And the 7 traits were, in that context, essentially a checklist that the Anunnaki administrators used to identify which members of the surviving human population had the cognitive and constitutional equipment for the work of civilizational reconstruction. The traits are not descriptions of spiritual virtue. They are competency assessments. The fact that they read, from a modern vantage point, like they might also be describing something biological and heritable, is not a coincidence. From the Sumerian perspective, the two things were the same. Administrative competence of the type required for civilizational governance was not a learned skill. It was an inherited capacity, and it was inherited from the Anunnaki line. This framework is uncomfortable for modern sensibilities that want to believe that all human beings are fundamentally equivalent in their potential. The Sumerians were not operating under that assumption. They were operating under a framework in which some individuals carried a different inheritance than others, and in which that difference was observable, measurable, and heritable. Whether that framework was correct in its metaphysics is a separate question from whether the traits it identified are real. The traits are real. We can establish that. We can establish it from the modern literature. And we can establish it from the simple observation that every culture that has ever tried to organize itself into a functional complex society has been forced to confront the fact that certain individuals are categorically different in their capacity for specific types of authority, cognition, and perception. Not different in degree, different in kind. The Sumerians were the first to write it down with enough specificity to be useful 3,000 years later. That is their gift to this inquiry, and we are going to accept it with the seriousness it deserves. The Sumerian record of what we have been calling Nephilim traits did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader administrative and theological tradition that ran through the entire arc of Mesopotamian civilization, from the first written records at the end of the 4th millennium BCE through the late Babylonian period more than 2,000 years later. What is extraordinary about the persistence of this tradition is not merely that it survived. Many religious and literary traditions survive across such spans. What is extraordinary is that the core observational content remained stable even as the surrounding cultural and political frameworks changed dramatically. The Sumerians gave way to the Akkadians. The Akkadians gave way to the Babylonians. The Babylonians came under Assyrian domination. The Assyrians fell to the combined forces of Babylonia and the Medes. The late Babylonian period ended with the Persian conquest under Cyrus the Great. Through all of these transitions, through the rise and fall of empires, through the replacement of Sumerian language by Akkadian as the dominant written medium, through the absorption of Sumerian deities into Akkadian and Babylonian pantheons under different names and with different mythological elaborations, the core taxonomy of the 7 traits and the fundamental understanding of their hereditary nature remained consistent. The Akkadian term for what the Sumerians called Mila, the first and least rare of the Nephilim traits, is Melamu. Scholars of Assyrian and Babylonian religion have given this term substantial attention because it appears so consistently across such a wide span of the Mesopotamian textual record, and because what it describes is so important to the governance ideology of every major Mesopotamian civilization. The Melamu of the gods and of great kings was a constitutive property, something they carried rather than something they performed. The texts describe it as covering or enveloping the individual who carries it, as visible to those with the capacity to perceive it, and as producing specific effects in those who encounter it: awe, deference, recognition of authority, the compelled desire to kneel or bow or acknowledge the superior nature of what stands before them. The continuity from Sumerian Mila to Akkadian Melamu to Babylonian rituals designed to transfer or restore or protect this property in the king is a straight documentary line across 2,000 years of Mesopotamian history. At no point does the tradition suggest that Melamu is a metaphor or a symbolic attribute. At every point, it is treated as a real, constitutional property of specific individuals that has real, observable effects on those who encounter it. The administrative concern about maintaining, protecting, and when necessary, restoring Melamu in the king, documented in Babylonian ritual texts that describe what must be done when the royal Melamu appears to diminish, is the concern of administrators managing a real asset, not theologians managing a metaphor. The same continuity appears, in less administrative and more literary form, in the Gilgamesh tradition. The earliest Sumerian Gilgamesh texts describe the king of Uruk in terms consistent with high expression of multiple Nephilim traits, simultaneously the Mila, the Enzeg, and what appears to be significant concentration of Sag-and-Amu in the character's unwillingness to be socially managed or constitutionally reshaped by any human or divine pressure. The Old Babylonian version of the Gilgamesh epic that comes 2 centuries later preserves the core character profile, while elaborating the narrative framework. The standard Babylonian version from the 1st millennium BCE, assembled by the scholar Sineleki Unnini, maintains the same constitutional profile while embedding it in a deeply philosophical meditation on mortality, friendship, and the limits of human achievement. What does not change across these versions is the fundamental description of what Gilgamesh is constitutionally. He is not simply a powerful king or a heroic warrior. He is a being in whom the Anunnaki inheritance is concentrated to the degree that it produces constitutional effects that neither the gods nor the human population can fully manage. The Sumerian administrative and literary tradition tracks this through its entire arc. The trait profile remains consistent. The institutional challenge of what to do with a being who carries these traits at such intensity also remains consistent. And the tragedy that the tradition associates with this kind of constitutional magnitude, the inevitable encounter with the limits of what any human framework, however extraordinary, can ultimately accommodate, also remains consistent. That tragic consistency is not accidental. The Sumerians, Akkadians, and Babylonians were not creating a narrative template for the sake of literary convention. They were documenting an observed reality, that individuals who carry the Nephilim traits at high intensity live within constraints that are both more and less than the constraints that govern ordinary human existence. More in the sense that the constitutional gifts produce demands and responsibilities in isolation that ordinary existence does not require. Less in the sense that the constitutional anchoring of the Saganamu carriers means that many of the existential anxieties that dominate ordinary human experience simply do not have the same grip. The tradition understood that this was a real profile of a real population of real individuals, not an idealized heroic type. The tablets document the difficulties as carefully as they document the gifts. They document the social consequences as carefully as they document the capacities. They document the institutional failures, the moments when the administrative structure failed to adequately support or appropriately channel the capabilities of Nephilim trait carriers, as carefully as they document the institutional successes. This is what separates the Sumerian documentation from mythology. Myths typically idealize their subjects. They smooth away the inconvenient edges, the social failures, the institutional breakdowns, the moments when the extraordinary individual is simply difficult to deal with in ways that produce real damage to real communities. The Sumerian documentation does not do this. It is too precise, too administratively grounded, and too committed to accuracy to flatter its subjects. The ancient Mesopotamian king who carried high concentrations of melamu was powerful and was recognized as powerful. He was also, the texts suggest with quiet consistency, difficult. The divine right that melamu conferred was not unconditional. The texts that document what happens when a king's melamu is not properly contained and directed when the constitutional magnitude of the trait produces destruction rather than order are not cautionary tales invented to constrain royal power. They are case studies drawn from the observed consequences of extraordinary constitutional capacity operating without adequate institutional scaffolding. The Sumerians knew that magnitude without structure produces chaos. They built their institutions to provide that structure, and they left the documentation of both the magnitude and the structure available for any civilization wise enough to read it carefully. We have, for the most part, failed to do that. We have read the mythology and missed the ethnography. We have read the hero stories and missed the case studies. We have celebrated the capacities and ignored the institutional wisdom about how to support and direct them, without either suppressing them or allowing them to operate without constraint. The 7 traits are not 7 stories. They are 7 documented observations about the human phenotypic range, ranked by rarity, with extensive notation about their practical consequences and their institutional management requirements. Reading them that way, as the Sumerian scribes intended them to be read, produces not inspiration or exaltation, but something more useful and more honest, a framework adequate to the reality of what some human beings actually are. The genealogical mechanics that the Sumerian tablets describe for the transmission and concentration of the 7 traits deserve extended treatment because they are both more sophisticated and more practically relevant than the general discussion of heredity and lineage might suggest. The tablets do not describe the 7 traits as inherited in the simple dominant recessive model that most people associate with genetic heredity. They describe them as concentration dependent, as capacities that exist, in varying degrees, in a large portion of the population with Anunnaki lineage background. But that crossed the threshold of observable expression only when the lineage concentration in a specific individual reaches a critical level. Below the threshold, the trait may influence the individual in subtle and consistent ways without fully expressing. Above the threshold, it becomes a defining constitutional feature. This concentration dependence model is consistent with what modern genetics calls polygenic threshold traits, characteristics that are produced by the combined effect of multiple genetic variants and that express distinctly only when a sufficient number of those variants are present. simultaneously. Height is a simple example. Hundreds of genes contribute to an individual's height, and the overall height distribution in the population is continuous, but certain medical conditions related to extreme height are threshold phenomena that manifest only in individuals who have both an unusual polygenic background for height and specific additional variants. The Nephilim traits, in the tablet's framework, are polygenic threshold phenomena in exactly this sense. Every individual with Anunnaki lineage in their genetic background carries some of the variant combinations that contribute to the traits. The vast majority carry enough to produce subtle influences, a slightly elevated baseline of what might register as presence, or perception, or constitutional stability without crossing the threshold of clear trait expression. The minority who cross the threshold are the ones the tablets identify and document. And within that minority, there is a gradient of expression that the tablets track with the precision of administrators who understand that constitutional capacity varies in magnitude across individuals in ways that matter for their practical deployment. The mechanism by which lineage concentration increases across generations is documented in the tablets, with what amounts to a genetic insight that predates Mendel by 3 millennia. The tablets note that individuals who carry one or more Nephilim traits at expression level are more likely to produce offspring who carry the same or additional traits at expression level, particularly when those individuals form families with others who carry similar concentrations. Not because they are deliberately selecting for the traits, the tablets do not describe arranged breeding programs, which would be ethically indefensible and historically unattested, but because the social gravitational pull of constitutional similarity means that individuals who carry high Anunnaki lineage concentrations tend to find each other, recognize something of themselves in each other, and form bonds that concentrate the lineage further in their offspring. This mechanism, the constitutional affinity that draws high concentration individuals together, is documented in the tablets as one of the primary ways in which the Nephilim bloodline has maintained itself through the millennia since the original hybridization event. Not through deliberate management, through the natural social dynamics of recognition, the tendency of individuals who carry the same constitutional fire to recognize that fire in each other, even across cultural and geographic distances, and to be drawn into proximity. The modern research on what psychologists call assortative mating, the tendency of individuals to form partnerships with others who are similar to themselves on measurable traits, is relevant here. Assortative mating is well documented for traits including intelligence, temperament, values, and a wide range of personality characteristics. The effect sizes are modest for most measured traits, but they accumulate across generations in ways that can substantially alter the distribution of trait combinations in a population over time. If the Nephilim traits show stronger than average assortative mating patterns, which the tablets suggest they would, given the constitutional recognition mechanism, then the lineage concentration mechanism the tablets describe is not only plausible but predictable from well-established population genetics principles. This has a practical implication that the tablets draw out explicitly. The individuals who carry the highest concentrations of the Nephilim traits are disproportionately likely to be found in the same social circles, the same communities, the same institutional environments, not because they have been placed there by deliberate design, but because the constitutional recognition mechanism draws them together. They find each other in the way that any population with distinctive phenotypic characteristics finds others who share those characteristics by noticing, without necessarily being able to articulate why they notice, that certain individuals feel fundamentally familiar in a way that most people do not. The Sumerian on tradition, the Abgal advisory system, and the various healing and divination institutions that the tablets document were not only functional structures for channeling Nephilim trait capacities into useful social roles, they were also, implicitly, community structures that brought high-concentration individuals into sustained contact with each other, providing the social environment in which constitutional recognition could occur, partnerships could form, and lineage concentration could increase across generations in exactly the way the tablets describe. We lack those community structures today. The high-concentration individuals in the current population are dispersed across a globalized world, with no institutional frameworks that recognize what they carry or provide the social environments in which they are likely to encounter each other at meaningful rates. The constitutional recognition mechanism still operates. Individuals who carry the traits still find each other, still recognize the familiar fire, still form connections that the ordinary social world cannot fully account for. But the rate at which this happens is, in the absence of institutional support, far lower than the tablets imply it was in the Anunnaki-governed civilization they were documenting. Whether the reconstruction of those community structures is possible in the current era, whether the social and institutional conditions exist in which individuals who carry the 7 traits can be identified, supported, and brought into sustained contact with each other is a question the tablets do not answer. They were written for a civilization in which those structures already existed. The reconstruction problem they leave to subsequent generations was not one they anticipated needing to solve themselves, but the recognition problem, the prior problem of knowing what to look for, of having an adequate description of the traits and their rarity and their significance. That problem the tablets do solve. They solve it with the precision and rigor of the civilization that invented writing, law, and astronomy simultaneously. And that solution is available now to anyone willing to read it with the seriousness it deserves. Trait 6. And here the tablets begin to describe something that the scribes treated with a different quality of attention. Trait 7, Mila. The radiance of executive presence was catalogued with the clinical efficiency of an administrative record. Trait 6 receives a different treatment. The passages that describe it are longer. The language is more careful. The analogies the scribes reach for are more elaborate. And the frequency estimates embedded in the text suggest that by the time you reach trait 6, you are looking at something present in perhaps 1 to 2% of the general population. The trait is called in the tablets by a compound term, Ijigal Nindazi. The translation is contested among scholars, but the most defensible rendering is something like seeing of the true bread, or more interpretively, perception of the living essence. The Iji in Sumerian means eye, but in compound usage it is almost always metaphorical. Ijigal means great eye, wisdom eye, or more precisely, the capacity to see what is actually present rather than what appears to be present. The Nindazi, the true bread or living substance, refers in the Anunnaki context to the underlying reality of things, rather than their surface form. Quick pause, and this is something new. For the first time since the 12 codes, there's a second document. It's called the 7 resets, every time the world was erased, matched against the 7 Nephilim traits, and the checklist of signs for the 8th 4 are already active. Linked below, QR code on screen. Back to the video. What the Sumerians are describing, in the language available to them in the 3rd millennium BCE, is what modern researchers call perceptual sensitivity that extends beyond ordinary sensory range. Not supernatural sight in the folkloric sense. Something more precise and more interesting. The capacity to receive and process information from environmental signals that most human nervous systems filter out entirely. The modern scientific literature on this is substantial and largely ignored in mainstream discourse because it challenges the premise that human sensory experience is uniform across individuals. It is not. The range of variation in sensory processing thresholds between individuals and the general population is enormous. What one person experiences as background noise, another experiences as actively attended sensory data. What one person's visual cortex dismisses as irrelevant pattern, another's processes as meaningful signal. What one person's interoceptive system, the internal sensory network that monitors bodily state, reports as vague discomfort, another's reports as a specific, localized, detailed account of systemic state. The tablets describe Ijigal Nindazi in terms that map onto the high end of this variation. Individuals who carry this trait perceive more. Not abstractly, not metaphorically, they literally receive more environmental data than standard, and they process it in ways that produce insights the standard processor cannot reach by any amount of deliberate reasoning. In ancient terms, this was called prophecy, or divination, or augury, or simply wisdom, depending on the cultural framework. In every case, the individual who could see the true bread was understood as someone whose perceptual access to reality was different in kind from that of ordinary people. Not smarter, not more learned, operating on a different bandwidth. The neurological substrate is, again, documented in the modern literature. High sensory processing sensitivity, first characterized systematically by Elaine Aron in the 1990s, but with roots in prior research on introversion and neurological reactivity, describes a population of individuals whose nervous systems process sensory information more deeply and completely than average. Aron estimated this trait present in approximately 15 to 20% of the population at a baseline level, but subsequent research has identified a gradient within that population, a smaller subset for whom the sensitivity extends into domains that begin to look less like a personality trait and more like a constitutional difference in neural architecture. The tablet's frequency estimate of 1 to 2% aligns with that inner gradient, not with Aron's baseline figure. What the Sumerians were identifying as the 6th Nephilim trait is not high sensitivity in the general sense. It is sensitivity at the constitutional extreme, the point at which the perceptual system is receiving inputs that cannot be readily communicated to others because others do not have access to the same data stream. This creates a specific and documented experiential problem. The individual who carries Ijigal Nindazi at the Nephilim level perceives accurately. Their readings of environment, of people, of situations, are frequently precise in ways that others find uncanny. But they cannot provide a satisfying account of how they arrived at their perception, because the reasoning chain is not verbal and sequential, it is perceptual and parallel. They know because they can see. But seeing is not an explanation that other people can follow. The tablets describe this as a burden that increases with the concentration of the trait. The deeper the perception, the harder it is to communicate. And the harder it is to communicate, the more isolated the carrier becomes. Not through any failure of social skill, Mila carriers often have abundant social skill. Through a more fundamental problem. The carrier of the sixth trait is receiving a different broadcast than everyone around them, and there is no translation protocol available. The Sumerian high priests, who served as interpreters between the Anunnaki and the human population, were, in the framework of the tablets, selected specifically for Ijigal Nindazi. The role of the En, the high priest or priestess, was not simply to perform ritual, it was to perceive accurately what the Anunnaki were communicating, and to translate that perception into forms the ordinary human administration could act on. The selection process for these roles, as described in the administrative texts, involved what amount to perceptual tests, situations designed to reveal whether the candidate could detect information that should not, by ordinary sensory means, be accessible. Modern dismissal of this selection process as superstition is, again, too quick. What the Sumerians were selecting for was real. The An who served at Nippur or Eridu was not chosen because they were pious or politically useful or born into the right family, though all of those factors may have played a role in who was presented as a candidate. They were chosen because they could perceive what others could not. And the tablets are clear that this capacity was understood as heritable. It ran in families, concentrated in lineages, and was recognized in individuals from childhood by behavioral markers the scribes documented with their usual precision. Those behavioral markers are worth dwelling on because they appear in the modern literature on early identification of high perceptual sensitivity in children. The tablets describe the child who carries Ijigal Nindazi as one who is distressed by things others do not notice, one who cannot be in spaces of unresolved conflict without physical discomfort, one who knows the content of other people's inner states in ways that disturb both the child and the adults around them, and one who requires more time than others to process experience because they are processing more of it. The modern literature on highly sensitive children describes identical presentations, the distress in chaotic or emotionally charged environments, the accurate perception of adult emotional states that adults believe they are concealing, the need for longer processing time, the difficulty with transitions that involves not just adjustment to change but the sensory recalibration required when the entire environmental data stream shifts. These are not random correlations. They are descriptions of the same underlying constitutional reality. The Sumerians documented it in the 3rd millennium BCE as a trait of Nephilim bloodlines. Modern developmental psychologists document it as an extreme end of a normal human variation. The question the tablets implicitly raise, whether it is normal variation or something that entered the human line from a different source, is not one that modern psychology is equipped to answer. But it is the right question to ask. The most extraordinary passage in the Sumerian documentation of Ijigal Nindazi describes what happens when this trait reaches its maximum expression. The tablets call this the opening of the third archive, a metaphor for a perceptual state in which the carrier gains access to information that is not only beyond ordinary sensory range, but is temporal in nature, not prediction in the folkloric sense, but something the scribes describe as the ability to read the structure of events before they have materialized in physical form. Modern physics offers a framework for understanding this that would have been alien to the Sumerians, but that they would have recognized as describing the right territory. At the quantum level, the universe does not operate on the classical principle of linear causation, cause then effect, one thing after another, information traveling forward in time at a fixed speed. Quantum entanglement demonstrates that information correlations between physically separated systems are instantaneous. Quantum fields describe reality not as a collection of discrete objects, but as a structured probability space in which events are not determinate until observation collapses possibility into actuality. If human perception is, in some individuals, sensitive not just to classical sensory inputs but to quantum-level structural patterns in the environment, And this is a hypothesis that a small but serious contingent of physicists and neuroscientists has been developing with increasing rigor since the 1990s. Then what the Sumerians called the opening of the third archive is not magical. It is perceptual access to a layer of information that standard human neurology filters as noise. The individuals who report experiences consistent with this description are not common. They appear across cultures, across historical periods, across every social stratum. They are not disproportionately credulous or psychologically disturbed. The research literature on accurate precognitive experience, whatever one makes of its interpretive implications, consistently finds that the individuals reporting such experiences are indistinguishable from the general population on standard psychological measures. What distinguishes them is the perceptual event itself. The Sumerians put this at trait 6, not at the top of the scale. There is something above it. The Ijigal Nindazi at full expression is still, by the tablet's account, less constitutionally distinctive than the traits above it. But it is already so far outside ordinary human experience that the individuals who carry it have, throughout documented history, been treated as something other than ordinary, as oracles, as prophets, as shamans, as seers, and occasionally, in less benevolent interpretive frameworks, as threats, because what the carrier of the sixth Nephilim trait sees is not always what the people in power want them to see. The genetic dimension of Ijigal Nindazi has been partially addressed in modern research, without reference to its Sumerian documentation, and the findings are striking enough to warrant careful attention. The serotonin transporter gene, known in the research literature as 5-HTT, or more specifically by its linked polymorphic region designation 5, HTTLPR has a short allele variant that is associated with heightened environmental sensitivity, deeper emotional processing, and stronger neural responses to both positive and negative environmental inputs. Individuals with 2 copies of the short allele, which is a minority of the population, show consistent patterns across multiple research domains. Stronger activation of the amygdala in response to emotional stimuli, deeper processing of social and environmental information, greater susceptibility to both environmental stress and environmental enrichment, and more accurate recall of emotional and relational details from social interactions. The frequency of the double short allele in the general population varies by ancestral group, but across human populations globally, it appears in roughly 10 to 20% of individuals at a phenotypically significant level. The tablet's estimate of 1 to 2% for the full Nephilim expression of this trait suggests that what the Sumerians were identifying was not the 5-HTTLPR short allele in general, but rather a combination of multiple genetic variants that, when present together, produce a perceptual profile substantially more extreme than any single gene variant accounts for. Modern behavioral genetics is beginning to identify these multi-gene combinations. The polygenic basis of sensory processing sensitivity involving not just the serotonin transporter but also dopamine regulation genes, genes associated with neural connectivity and processing speed, and genes governing the threshold parameters of the autonomic nervous system is an area of active research. The Sumerians, without any of this genetic vocabulary, were identifying the phenotypic outcome of these multi-gene interactions and classifying it as a heritable lineage trait. They were right. It is heritable. It does run in families. And when it concentrates in a lineage across multiple generations, exactly the kind of intensification that would occur if the originating source of the variant were a population of beings who bred consistently with humans carrying the trait, the resulting expression is qualitatively different from the garden variety high sensitivity that the modern literature describes. The Sumerians called that qualitative difference the Nephilim threshold, the point at which the concentration of the old lineage becomes sufficient that what emerges is not just an unusually sensitive human, but something that the tablets treat as a different category of perceiver. Not different in species, different in constitutional access to what is real. That distinction is going to matter more and more as we move up the rarity scale. The oracle traditions of the ancient world, the Delphic oracle, the Roman augurs, the Hebrew prophets, the Vedic rishis, the Chinese oracle bone diviners, the Mayan daykeepers have been studied extensively as religious and cultural phenomena. They have been studied far less frequently as institutional frameworks for identifying, training, and deploying individuals who carry what the Sumerians called Ijigal Nindazi at high levels of expression. That institutional dimension is what makes the comparative study of oracle traditions relevant to this inquiry. Because when you examine these traditions, not as religious phenomena, but as institutions with selection criteria, training programs, deployment protocols, and quality control mechanisms, They reveal a consistent underlying architecture that reflects a consistent underlying recognition. That certain individuals have access to perceptual information that others do not have access to. That this access is constitutional rather than learned. That it can be cultivated and disciplined, but not manufactured. And that society benefits from having institutional structures that identify these individuals early, train them appropriately, and provide sanctioned contexts for the productive deployment of their perceptual capacity. The Delphic oracle's selection process for the Pythia, the woman who served as the primary vehicle for Apollo's communication at Delphi, is documented in ancient sources well enough to extract the selection criteria. The Pythia was required to be a local woman of good standing, initially a young woman, and later, after certain alleged improprieties, a woman over 50 regardless of her previous status. What the formal requirements do not say, but what the practical history of the institution implies, is that the selection was not random among eligible women. The Pythia was selected because she demonstrated, in preliminary interactions with the temple authorities, the perceptual capacity that would allow her to function effectively in the role. Not every eligible woman was tested. The women who were tested were identified through less formal recognition processes through the judgment of the existing temple community, who were presumably skilled at recognizing Igigal Nindazi in its characteristic behavioral presentations. The Pythia's pronouncements, delivered in a state of trance, induced by breathing vapors from a chasm in the temple floor, the geological reality of which was confirmed by modern archaeologists who found ethylene-producing geological faults at the site, were then interpreted by the male priests of Delphi and rendered into the hexameter verse that became the formal oracle. The arrangement is significant. It creates a two-stage process: the raw perceptual output from the high Igigal Nindazi carrier, and the disciplined interpretation by trained priests who applied the appropriate contextual framework. Neither stage alone is sufficient. The perceptual capacity without disciplined interpretation produces outputs that cannot be usefully received by ordinary political and military decision-makers. The disciplined interpretation without genuine perceptual capacity produces elaborated guesses that lack the accuracy that made Delphi's reputation. The Sumerians built the same two-stage architecture into their oracle institutions. The On, who carried Igigal Nindazi, provided the direct perceptual access to what the tablets call the true bread, the underlying reality of the situation being inquired about. The trained scribal staff who worked with the On provided the interpretive and communicative framework that allowed the perceptual output to be rendered into forms the governance structure could act on. The Sumerian tradition was more explicit than the Delphi tradition about the constitutional nature of the N's capacity, and more systematic about the selection and training processes. But the fundamental institutional architecture was identical. This identity is not coincidental. It reflects the fact that both traditions were solving the same practical problem with the same understanding of what the problem was. Both understood that the perceptual capacity involved is real and constitutional, not cultivated or performed. Both understood that it requires institutional support to function accurately and productively. Both understood that the gap between the perceptual output and what ordinary decision-makers can directly receive requires an interpretive mediation layer. And both built institutions that provided all three of these things. The Hebrew prophetic tradition is more complicated because it spans a longer historical period and involves more explicit theological content, but its institutional dimension shows the same architecture. The Nevi'im, the prophets, were not solitary spiritual individuals operating outside institutional frameworks. They were, particularly in the earlier prophetic tradition, members of prophetic schools, communities of individuals with similar constitutional profiles, training under established prophets, living in the kind of sustained proximity that the Sumerian framework would predict, produces both mutual recognition and lineage concentration. The Ben Novi, the sons of the prophets, as the Hebrew text calls them, were not biological sons in most cases. They were students, apprentices, members of the prophetic community who were identified as carrying the constitutional characteristics that the prophetic role required and who trained under established prophets, in the same way that Azu apprentices trained under established Azu masters in the Sumerian healing tradition. The community provided the constitutional recognition, the training, the interpretive framework, and the social context within which the perceptual capacity of individual members could be deployed accurately and productively. What happened to the Hebrew prophetic tradition is, in some respects, a microcosm of what happened to all of these traditions. The prophetic schools of the early monarchy period gave way to the individual prophets of the classical period, who in turn gave way to the theological interpretation of prophecy that characterized the rabbinic tradition, which ultimately preserved the texts of the prophets but largely abandoned the institutional framework for identifying and training new individuals with the underlying constitutional profile. The capacity did not disappear from the population. The institution for channeling it disappeared. And the capacity, without institutional support and context, went either unrecognized or was absorbed into frameworks mystical, Kabbalistic, charismatic religious that were not designed to accommodate it with the precision that the original prophetic institution had provided. The global pattern is consistent. The institutional frameworks that the ancient world built for recognizing and deploying Ijigal Ninda Z carriers, oracle traditions, prophetic schools, healing temples, divination practices all underwent a similar trajectory: high institutional sophistication in their prime, gradual degradation as the underlying framework for understanding the constitutional nature of the capacity was lost or diluted, eventual collapse into either religious elaboration or cultural dismissal. The oracle at Delphi closed in the 4th century CE, by tradition, when the god could no longer speak through the Pythia. The Hebrew prophetic tradition maintained its textual legacy, but lost its institutional practice. The Vedic Rishi tradition became embedded in Brahminical hierarchies that preserved the texts, but transformed the institutional framework beyond recognition. In every case, what was lost was not the capacity in the population. Individuals with Igigal Ninda Z continue to be born, as they have always been born, in the proportions the Sumerian tablets predicted. What was lost was the recognition of the capacity, the training for its disciplined application, and the institutional context for its productive deployment. The loss was not of the trait, it was of the wisdom to know what to do with it. The modern world is, in this respect, operating at a level of institutional sophistication regarding this particular dimension of human constitutional diversity that is far below what the ancient oracle traditions represented at their best. The individuals who carry Ijigal Ninda Z in the current era are not entirely without resources. Therapeutic traditions, contemplative practices, and various intuitive training methods provide partial support for the development and management of the capacity. But the institutional architecture that would allow their perceptual outputs to be systematically received, interpreted, and deployed in ways that serve collective governance and decision-making is almost entirely absent. This is not a mystical argument. It is a practical administrative argument. The Sumerians built the Abgal and the On traditions because they found that having access to the perceptual capacities those traditions mobilized produced better governance outcomes. The Greeks built the Delphic institution because they found that the consultation process produced better strategic decisions than purely conventional analysis. The Hebrews maintained the prophetic tradition because they found that prophetic input provided governance information they could not obtain through ordinary means. We have abandoned those institutional conclusions without adequately evaluating whether they were sound. The available evidence suggests they were, and the cost of their abandonment is continuing to compound. The neuroscience of the 6th Nephilim trait, Igigal Ninda Z, has advanced significantly in the last decade, in ways that the early high-sensitivity research could not have predicted, and those advances make the Sumerian framework look increasingly less like ancient mythology and more like a sophisticated pre-scientific description of real constitutional neurology. The default mode network has emerged as perhaps the most important neural architecture for understanding constitutional perceptual differences between individuals, and recent research on default mode network function has produced findings directly relevant to the Ijigal Ninda Z profile. A 2021 paper in Nature Neuroscience documented a subpopulation of individuals representing roughly 3 to 5% of the sample, whose default mode network showed an unusual combination of features: extremely high resting state connectivity, unusually rapid and deep integration between the default mode network and sensory processing areas, and a failure of the normal deactivation response when external task demands increased. This last feature is crucial. The standard neural response to increasing external demand is a trade-off. The task-positive networks that handle external processing increase their activity, while the default mode network decreases its activity, freeing up cognitive resources for the external task. In the subpopulation identified in the 2021 study, this trade-off did not occur in the standard way. The default mode network remained active even as external task demands increased, producing a condition in which external processing and internal integration were occurring in parallel rather than in sequence. The perceptual experience associated with this neural profile, as reported by participants in the 2021 study and in subsequent replications, is precisely what the Sumerian description of Ijigal Ninda Z would predict. These individuals reported experiencing a constant background awareness of pattern and meaning in their environment that persisted through ordinary task performance. They described their perceptual field as richer than they understood other people's to be, not in a grandiose or self-congratulatory way, but in the practical sense that they seemed to be receiving information that others were not receiving, and that this information was both useful and exhausting in its volume and insistence. Several participants described what researchers in the study carefully termed hyperpattern sensitivity, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in environmental inputs at a rate and with a specificity that exceeds what the ordinary pattern recognition literature would predict for the amount of data available. These were not delusional pattern perceptions. In the series of tasks designed to test pattern recognition accuracy, the high default mode connectivity participants performed significantly better than the comparison group on tasks involving detection of faint or embedded signal patterns in complex sensory fields. They were not seeing patterns that weren't there. They were seeing patterns that were there but that the comparison group consistently missed. This is the empirical core of Ijigal Nindazi. Not mystical perception, not supernatural access to hidden information. Constitutional neural architecture that processes available sensory data at greater depth and integrates it across a larger network simultaneously, producing access to patterns in the data that standard neural processing misses. The Sumerians described the outcome, the broader perception of the true bread, the living essence of what is present. The neuroscience is now beginning to describe the mechanism. The frequency of the neural profile, identified in the 2021 study 3 to 5% at a moderate level of expression, is consistent with the Sumerian frequency estimate for the 6th Nephilim trait at its moderate expression levels. The frequency at the constitutional extreme, the level the tablets treat as the Nephilim threshold, at which the trait is a defining constitutional feature rather than a notable individual characteristic, has not been precisely established in the neuroscience literature, but the distributional data from the 2021 study and its replication suggests it is substantially below 1%, which is again exactly what the tablets predicted. Trait 5. This is where the Sumerian scribes begin to use language that has no comfortable equivalent in modern academic discourse, and where the tablets themselves seem to shift registers from administrative documentation to something more cautious, as if the authors were aware that what they were describing crossed a threshold of significance that warranted a different quality of attention. The 5th trait is called Nzag, sometimes rendered Nzag. The An in Sumerian designates the sky or heaven, the domain of the Anunnaki before their physical descent, the realm of the cosmic order from which the divine governance descended. Zag means boundary, edge, limit, or more precisely, the point at which one domain ends and another begins. Anzag, then, is the boundary of heaven, or more interpretively, the awareness of the interface between the ordered cosmos and the physical world. But what the tablets mean by Anzag as a heritable trait is not a philosophical awareness. It is a direct perceptual capacity. The individual who carries Nzag at the Nephilim threshold can perceive the structure of what the Sumerians called the me, the organizing principles that govern reality not as abstract concepts but as concrete experiences, not through reasoning, not through mystical practice, directly, constitutively, as a feature of ordinary perception that is simply present in the way that color perception is present for those who have it and absent for those who do not. The modern analog closest to this is synesthesia, the neurological condition in which sensory information from one modality spontaneously produces perceptual experience in another. A person with chromesthesia experiences sounds as colors. A person with lexical color synesthesia experiences letters and numbers as having inherent colors that are consistent across time and context. A person with spatial sequence synesthesia experiences abstract sequences, numbers, months of the year, historical periods as having specific locations in three-dimensional space that the person navigates as real spatial terrain. Synesthesia is not metaphor. It is not imagination. It is a structural feature of how the brain processes information, and it is entirely consistent between reports from the same individual over time. The colors a letter has for a synesthete are the same colors that letter has had since childhood. The spatial location of March, in the sequence of months, is the same location it has always occupied. The perceptual experience is as stable as the experience of the external world is for ordinary perceivers. Synesthesia occurs in approximately 4% of the general population at a reliably reported level, though the figure rises when mild and inconsistent forms are included. Within that 4%, there is a gradient of intensity from individuals who notice their cross-modal perceptions as interesting background features of experience to individuals for whom the synesthetic perception is primary, dominant, and sometimes overwhelming. Anzag as the Sumerians describe it, is synesthesia extended beyond sensory modalities into the structural domain. Not just sounds experienced as colors, but the organizing principles of reality experienced as perceptual events. The person who carries in Zag at the Nephilim level does not think about the structure of a situation. They perceive it. They do not analyze the emotional valence of a relationship dynamic. They experience it as a direct sensory event with spatial and temporal properties. They do not reason about the underlying pattern in a complex system. They see it as a feature of the perceptual field, in the way that ordinary people see the color of an object as a feature of the perceptual field. The consequences for daily functioning are, by the tablet's account, profound. An individual who experiences the organizational structure of reality as direct perception rather than inferential conclusion is operating in a fundamentally different cognitive environment than everyone around them. The me that govern a situation, the power dynamics, the hidden motivations, the structural tensions that will eventually produce specific outcomes are as visible to them as the furniture in a room. And this means they are perpetually navigating a gap between what they perceive and what the people around them report experiencing. This gap is not merely a communication problem, it is an existential condition. The tablets describe Zag carriers as those who stand at the threshold without the ability to entirely enter either world. The structured world of direct perception that they inhabit, in which the underlying architecture of events is visible, is not a world that other people can easily follow them into. And the common sense world that other people inhabit, in which the surface of events is taken as a reliable guide to their meaning, is a world that the Zag carrier knows to be systematically incomplete in ways that ordinary people cannot see. The historical figures who display the behavioral signature of Zag at the Nephilim level are not difficult to identify. The problem is that identifying them retrospectively requires looking past the framework their own cultures applied to their experience, which was usually religious, prophetic, or mystical, and identifying the underlying perceptual structure that the framework was built to accommodate. The Sumerian On priests are the most directly documented cases. The On at Nippur, who served the god Enlil, or the On at Eridu, who served Enki, was not simply performing ritual. The administrative texts describe the N's practical function in terms that are consistent with what we have identified as Zag. The ability to read the underlying structure of civic and cosmic events and to provide guidance on that basis that could not have been derived from the available evidence by ordinary inferential reasoning. The texts that survive from the On tradition, the hymns, the oracular statements, the ritual instructions read, when examined as perceptual reports rather than religious poetry, like the testimony of someone describing direct perceptual access to structural features of reality that others are inferring at best. The most famous On in the Sumerian record is Enheduanna, the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who served as high priestess at Ur and who is the first named author in literary history. Her hymns to Inanna are not devotional poetry in any simple sense. They are, at several points, accounts of perceptual experience of seeing the divine in a direct, non-inferential way that she describes with careful phenomenological specificity. If you read Enheduanna's hymns as the testimony of someone carrying Zag at the Nephilim level, they become coherent in a way they are not if you read them as religious metaphor. She is not speaking figuratively about divine encounter. She is reporting what she sees. And what she sees is the structural reality of cosmic governance, the me in action, as a perceptual event. That is not mysticism. That is Zag. The Egyptian parallel is the concept of Ma'at, usually translated as truth, justice, or the cosmic order. The pharaoh's role as the embodiment of Ma'at is not a political metaphor. The Egyptian framework understood the pharaoh as someone who constitutively perceived Ma'at, who saw the ordering principle of reality as a direct perceptual fact, rather than a philosophical concept. The capacity to see Ma'at was understood as a hereditary trait, concentrated in the royal bloodline, not universal across humanity. The Egyptian Book of the Dead's judgment scene, in which the deceased's heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, is a perceptual test, a determination of whether the individual lived in alignment with the organizing structure of reality that they may or may not have been equipped to perceive. The Greek philosophical tradition encodes the same insight in the doctrine of the forms. Plato's theory that the visible world is a shadow of the true structural reality, the world of forms that is accessible to the philosophical mind through sustained rational inquiry, is, when read as perceptual phenomenology rather than metaphysics, a description of what happens when an individual with Zag at a lower or inconsistent level tries to systematize their intermittent perceptual access to the structural domain. The forms are the Me. The philosophical method is an attempt to reach by systematic reasoning what the Anzag carrier reaches directly through perception. Plato knew this. The famous allegory of the cave, in which the philosopher who has seen the sun returns to the cave and is unable to convince those who have never left that the shadows on the wall are not the fundamental reality, is a precise description of the social situation of the Anzag carrier. Not because Plato was claiming to carry the trait himself, though his description of Socrates in the dialogues is consistent with Anzag phenomenology, but because he had observed the pattern often enough to encode it in philosophical narrative. The neuroscientific basis of Anzag, understood as extreme cross-domain pattern integration, is one of the most active areas of current cognitive research, though researchers do not use that terminology. The default mode network, a set of brain regions that are active during rest and self-referential thought, and that show consistent co-activation during tasks involving conceptual reasoning, imagination, and social cognition, varies substantially between individuals in both its connectivity and its resting state activity level. In the majority of the population, the default mode network deactivates when external task demands increase. The brain's task-positive networks take over, and the default mode quiets. This is considered the standard pattern. In a minority of individuals, the default mode network shows unusual behavior during external task performance. Instead of deactivating, it remains partially or fully active in parallel with the task-positive networks. These individuals are processing external information simultaneously with internal, conceptual, and imaginative processes. They are doing two things at once, at the neural level, attending to external reality and maintaining active integration with the internal conceptual network that connects abstract patterns. The perceptual experience of this dual processing state is, by the reports of individuals who have participated in neuroimaging research while describing their phenomenology, something like what the Sumerians described as Anzag. Not two separate experiences happening side by side. One unified perceptual field in which external events are immediately and automatically placed in their structural context. In which the me of a situation, to use the Sumerian term, is not a conclusion reached after analysis, but a feature of how the situation appears. The frequency of this neural pattern, at a level sufficient to produce the Anzag perceptual experience, based on current neuroimaging research on default mode network coupling, is estimated at roughly 1 to 3% of the population. The tablet's estimate for the fifth Nephilim trait is less than 1%. The gap between 1 to 3% and less than 1% may reflect the difference between the neural pattern at a moderate level and the neural pattern at an intensity sufficient to produce consistent, reliable, cross-domain structural perception rather than intermittent or domain-specific cross-modal experience. The Sumerians were identifying the constitutional extreme, as they always were. The traits they cataloged were not the moderate expressions of these variations. They were the concentrated, lineage-intensified versions in which the trait is expressed so fully that it becomes a defining feature of the person's entire mode of being in the world rather than an interesting quirk of their cognitive style. Less than 1% of the current human population, by the tablet's reckoning, carries Anzag at the Nephilim threshold. In a global population of 8 billion, that is roughly 80 million people. That sounds like a large absolute number, until you consider that those 80 million are distributed across every culture, every country, every social class, every historical period, without any institutional framework for recognizing what they carry or any community of others who share the same perceptual reality. The most common experience reported by individuals who, in modern contexts, describe a perceptual mode consistent with an Anzag is that they have spent their entire lives wondering if they are broken. Because the structural perception they have access to is not valued, not recognized, and not explainable within any framework that ordinary cognitive culture provides. They are told they are imaginative, or philosophical, or intuitive, or spiritual. None of these descriptions captures what is actually happening. None of them provide a framework in which the perceptual capacity can be recognized, developed, and applied. The Sumerian framework did. The On tradition was precisely an institutional structure for identifying individuals who carried Anzag, training them in the rigorous discipline required to use the capacity accurately, and giving their perceptual outputs a legitimate social function. The system was not perfect. The potential for fraud, for wishful interpretation, for the pressure of institutional expectation to distort perceptual reports, was real and occasionally documented in the tablets themselves. But the underlying recognition that some people see the structure of reality directly, that this is a heritable constitutional capacity, and that society should have a use for it, was both accurate and consequential. We lost that recognition. Whether it was the flood that disrupted the institutional continuity, or the subsequent cultural shifts that replaced the Sumerian framework with religious and philosophical systems less equipped to accommodate it, or the gradual dilution of the lineage that made the trait rarer and therefore less institutionally prominent, we lost it. And the individuals who carry and zag today are navigating a world that has no category for what they are, using frameworks that were not built for them, in a cognitive culture organized almost entirely around the perceptual norms of the 99%. The tablets end their discussion of the fifth trait with a passage that has been translated in several ways, but that one rendering captures best. They see what the gods see, but they stand where humans stand. And that gap is the whole of their difficulty. Before we reach the final four traits, and the final four are where this inquiry becomes something more than historical, we need to address a question that the skeptical, rigorously scientific mind is absolutely right to ask. And that question is this: what is actually being claimed here? Because there are several different claims nested inside this inquiry, and they are not all equally supported, and conflating them is exactly the kind of imprecision that discredits otherwise serious work. The first claim is that the Sumerian tablets describe, with specificity and consistency, a set of 7 heritable traits that the scribes associated with lineages they understood as carrying elevated Anunnaki ancestry. This claim is not controversial. The textual evidence supports it. The tablets describe these traits. They rank them by rarity, and they document them with the clinical precision that characterizes the Sumerian administrative tradition. The second claim is that the 7 traits the tablets describe correspond to real, measurable, heritable characteristics that exist in the modern human population. This claim is also well supported. Every trait we have discussed so far, and every trait we are about to discuss, has a modern scientific correlate that is documented in peer-reviewed literature. The correspondence is too systematic and too specific to be coincidental. The third claim is more contested, and intellectual honesty requires distinguishing it clearly from the first two. The claim that these traits entered the human population through hybridization with a non-human species or group of beings. This is the claim that the Sumerians themselves made. It is the claim that the ancient astronaut framework takes literally, and it is the claim that mainstream science does not currently accept. On this third claim, the honest position is neither confident affirmation nor confident rejection. It is methodological openness. The Sumerians had better documentary access to the period they were describing than we do. The traits they identified are real. The genetic anomalies in the modern human population, the ghost lineages, the introgression signals, the unexplained distribution of certain rare variants are also real. Whether those anomalies represent hybridization with an undocumented hominid species, gradual in-group evolutionary drift, or something the current scientific framework does not yet have adequate conceptual tools to categorize, is a question that cannot be resolved with current evidence. What can be said with confidence is that the Sumerian account, taken as ethnographic documentation rather than mythology, generates testable predictions. It predicts that the 7 traits are heritable. Modern genetics confirms this. It predicts that they concentrate in lineages that families carrying one trait are more likely to carry others. The modern research on high sensitivity, executive presence, cross-domain pattern integration, and several other traits we are about to discuss does show familial clustering. It predicts that individuals carrying multiple traits will have characteristic experiences of social distinctiveness that have been recognized across cultures throughout history. The historical record supports this. None of this proves the Anunnaki hypothesis in its strong form. It does establish that the Sumerian scribes were not fabricating. They were documenting a real population of individuals with real, measurable, heritable characteristics, using the best descriptive framework available to them in their time and place. That the explanatory account they offered for why those individuals exist is contested does not change the validity of the underlying observation. That distinction matters enormously as we move into the top 4 traits, because the top 4 are the ones that mainstream culture has the most difficulty with, not because they do not exist, but because they exist in a register where the established categories of scientific explanation become genuinely incomplete. The population genetics dimension of this inquiry has developed significantly over the last 15 years, and some of what has been found is relevant enough to warrant extended treatment here. The ancient DNA revolution, the capacity to extract and sequence genetic material from archaeological specimens of increasing age, has fundamentally changed the picture of human prehistory. Before ancient DNA analysis, the consensus view of human evolutionary history was relatively tidy. Anatomically, modern humans emerged in Africa, migrated outward, replaced archaic populations in Eurasia and elsewhere, and the modern human population descended from a fairly well-characterized lineage. The ancient DNA evidence has made that picture considerably more complicated. The Denisovans, a hominin group whose existence was not known until 2010, appear to have contributed substantial genetic material to the ancestral populations of what are now Melanesia, Aboriginal Australia, and parts of South and Southeast Asia. The contribution is not trivial. Some Melanesian populations carry up to 4 to 6% Denisovan-derived sequence in their genomes. The Neanderthal contribution to non-African modern human genomes, now well established, averages around 2% but shows significant variation between individuals, with some people carrying substantially higher proportions in specific genomic regions. But perhaps more striking than the documented introgression from Neanderthals and Denisovans is the evidence for additional, undocumented contributions. Population genetics analyses of modern human genomes have identified what researchers call ghost lineages, statistical signatures, consistent with admixture from populations that have not yet been identified archaeologically, genetically. These signatures appear in African populations, in South Asian populations, and in several other groups. They represent genetic contributions from beings who existed, who interbred with the ancestors of modern humans, and who have left no identified physical or genetic traces beyond the signal in our genomes. The mainstream interpretation of these ghost lineages is that they represent undiscovered archaic hominids, late surviving branches of the Homo genus that we have not yet found in the fossil or ancient DNA record. That interpretation is almost certainly at least partially correct, but it does not entirely account for the specificity of what the ancient DNA record shows. The unusual variants, the rare alleles that appear in modern populations at frequencies inconsistent with neutral evolution, that show strong signatures of recent positive selection, despite being present in only small fractions of the population, that cluster in specific family lineages and geographic groups rather than distributing uniformly, these are not explained by admixture with archaic hominids whose cognitive and behavioral profiles we understand to have been substantially below modern human capacity. What the Sumerians were documenting may have been the behavioral and cognitive phenotype associated with some of these unusual variants. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But the subset that produces the 7 traits, the constitutional differences, that the scribes had enough access to characterize in systematic detail, may have left exactly the kind of lineage-concentrated signature that the population genetics literature is finding. This is a hypothesis. It is not established science, but it is a hypothesis that fits the available evidence better than any alternative currently on offer. And it is a hypothesis that the Sumerians themselves were making in their own vocabulary 4,000 years before the relevant scientific tools existed to evaluate it. Trait 4. We are now in territory where the tablets shift tone again. The first 3 traits we have discussed, Mila, Ijigal, Nindazi, and Nzag, were documented with the administrative efficiency of the Sumerian scribal tradition, augmented by careful phenomenological description. The 4th trait receives a treatment that is more extended, more historically situated, and more explicitly framed as something the scribes considered dangerous to possess without the correct institutional context. The trait is called Namzushita. The Nam prefix in Sumerian indicates fate, nature, or essential character. Zu means to know, but not the quotidian knowledge of learned information. Zu in the Sumerian philosophical vocabulary means to know in the sense of direct apprehension of essence, the same deep knowing embedded in the Sumerian creation accounts, where Enki's knowledge of the structure of reality is not catalogued information, but constitutional intimacy with how things are. The Shita element is more complex. It means approximately the governing thread or the causal root, the underlying cause from which surface phenomena flow. Namzushita, then, is something like the nature of knowing the governing cause, or more interpretively, the capacity to perceive causal structure at a level below observable phenomena. The trait of seeing not just what is happening but why it is happening, and not just why it is happening in the conventional analytical sense, but why it was always going to happen, the perception of inevitability in the deep structure of events before the surface manifestation reveals it. This is not intuition in any soft or vague sense. The tablets describe it with technical precision. The individual who carries Namzushita does not have good instincts or reliable hunches. They have direct perceptual access to the causal network that governs specific situations. They perceive which threads are load-bearing and which are incidental. They know which interventions will propagate through the system and which will dissipate without effect. And they know this before the system has produced the outcomes that would, in retrospect, make the causal structure obvious. This is what the Sumerians meant when they described Enki as the god of wisdom. Not that Enki was well-informed or highly intelligent, that Enki saw the causal architecture of reality, that he could look at any situation and immediately perceive which forces were actually driving it. The tablets describe Enki consistently as the one who knows the fate before it is decreed, the one who reads the river before it floods. He is not predicting, he is perceiving. The causal structure is available to him as a direct perceptual fact. For the Nephilim descendants who carry Namzushita at the heritable level, this perceptual capacity is present not as full Anunnaki-level omniscience, but as a constitutional tendency to perceive causal depth that others do not. The experience is commonly described, in the language of modern testimony that aligns with this framework, as always being a few steps ahead but being unable to explain why. Not because the perception is vague, it is typically quite specific, but because the causal chain that produced the perception is not accessible as an explicit reasoning sequence that can be walked through with others. The modern literature addresses this in the context of what researchers call systems thinking, the cognitive capacity to perceive the dynamic interactions within complex systems, rather than analyzing components in isolation. Systems thinkers exist along a continuum of ability, and at the high end of that continuum, the capacity to perceive system dynamics produces exactly the behavioral signature the tablets describe. Accurate predictions about the eventual behavior of complex systems, based on perception of structural tensions that others have not identified, communicated through conclusions that others find either uncanny or unconvincing depending on whether those others are inclined to trust the perceiver. But Namzushita, as the tablets describe it, goes beyond systems thinking in the academic sense. Systems thinking is a learnable cognitive skill. It improves with practice, with training, with the acquisition of systems, dynamics, concepts, and tools. What the tablets describe is constitutional. It is present in the individual before any training, before any relevant experience, often from early childhood, and it does not require the scaffolding of systems concepts to operate. It is a direct perceptual capacity, not a learned analytical framework. The child who carries Namzushita at the Nephilim level will typically demonstrate, from an early age, an ability to identify which aspects of a situation are actually determining its trajectory that disturbs and impresses adults around them. They will understand, without being able to articulate how they understand, that the obvious explanation for an event is not the actual explanation, that the stated reason for a decision is not the governing reason, that the apparent center of a social dynamic is not the actual center, not because they are cynical or mistrustful by nature, but because the causal structure is simply visible to them. This creates, in the contemporary context, a specific and characteristic social difficulty. The individual who carries Namzushita accurately perceives the causal architecture of situations, but inhabits a social world that rewards the articulation of conventional reasoning chains. Saying this is what's really happening is socially viable only when you can explain how you know. The Namzushita carrier often cannot explain how they know. They see it, and in a cognitive culture that privileges explicit reasoning over direct perceptual access to causal structure, they are either dismissed as presumptuous or celebrated as unnervingly accurate, with little social infrastructure available to integrate what they offer into productive collective decision-making. The Sumerian solution was institutional. The Anunnaki governance structure, as the tablets describe it, explicitly included individuals who carried Namzushita in its advisory architecture. The Abgal, the sage, the advisor to the king, the one whose counsel was sought before decisions of consequence, was selected in part for Namzushita. Not for wisdom in the abstract sense, but for the specific constitutional capacity to see causal architecture that administrators and rulers could not see for themselves. The Abgal tradition, documented across Sumerian and Akkadian literature, is the institutional acknowledgement that causal perception of this type is real, that it is heritable, that it is rare, and that it is too valuable to leave unincorporated into the governance structure. The tablets that describe the duties of the Abgal read, in their specificity, less like religious ritual prescription and more like a job description for someone whose primary qualification is a constitutional perceptual capacity that others lack. The frequency of Namzushita at the Nephilim threshold, as the tablets document it, is approximately 1 in 200 to 1 in 300 individuals. In a global population of 8 billion, that represents somewhere between 26 million and 40 million people alive right now who carry this trait at the level the Sumerians identified as constitutively significant. The distribution is not uniform across populations. The tablets suggest, and the modern genetic evidence is consistent with, the idea that certain family lineages and regional populations carry a higher frequency of the trait than the global average. This is exactly what you would expect if the trait originated with a specific group of beings whose descendants interbred preferentially within certain communities and geographic regions. The concentration would persist in those lineages for many generations before diluting to background levels. The regions the tablets identify as having the highest density of Nam-Zushita carriers in the pre-flood period include, not surprisingly, the Sumerian heartland itself, the southern alluvial plain of Mesopotamia, where the first cities were established and where the Anunnaki presence was most concentrated. They also include areas to the north and east of Mesopotamia that correspond, in the modern geographic picture, to the Fertile Crescent broadly defined, the Iranian Plateau, and the Caucasus region. Modern population genetics has identified, in precisely these regions, several unusual genetic variants that show distribution patterns inconsistent with standard models of neutral evolution or conventional selection pressure. Some of these variants cluster in neural development genes, genes governing the construction of the cortical architecture that would mediate the kind of deep causal perception the tablets describe. The specific genes that might underlie Nam-Zushita as a heritable constitutional capacity would be expected to be genes governing the density and connectivity of the anterior prefrontal cortex, the speed and depth of signal integration between the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system, and the threshold parameters of the default mode network's causal inference functions. Research on the neuroscience of causal reasoning consistently finds that the ability to identify non-obvious causal relationships, to see past the salient surface explanation to the structural explanation underneath it, is mediated by anterior prefrontal circuits that vary substantially between individuals in their connectivity, processing speed, and resting state activity. The extreme high end of this variation, the individuals whose anterior prefrontal systems are so robustly connected to the rest of the neural architecture that they process causal structure at a rate and depth unavailable to the majority, produces the behavioral signature that the tablets document as Nam-Zushita. The tablets note that this trait, unlike the first three, tends to be recognized by others as constitutionally significant, even without the Sumerian framework to name it. Because the behavioral signature is hard to miss, the individual who consistently identifies the actual cause of complex events, often before those events have resolved, in ways that cannot be explained by available information, produces a response in others that falls somewhere between awe and discomfort. They are frequently described, by those who know them, as uncanny, as seeing through walls, as knowing things they should not know. The should not is the tell. It reveals that the observer has identified a gap between the information available and the perception reported, and has correctly concluded that ordinary inferential reasoning from available information does not account for the perception. What they have not concluded, because no mainstream framework gives them the vocabulary for it, is that the perceiver is not reasoning from information. They are seeing structure. The comparative mythological record consistently elevates Nam-Zushita carriers to positions of advisory authority. The Indian figure of the rishi, the seer, whose perceptions of dharma, the underlying order of things, provide the framework for both personal conduct and social governance, is a Nam-Zushita description. The rishi does not derive dharma from argument. They perceive it. The Vedic tradition's explicit acknowledgement that the rishis received the Vedas through direct perception, not through logical derivation or divine revelation in the conventional sense, is consistent with the constitutional perceptual capacity the Sumerians were describing. Before we move on to the global sage tradition, stop. What you just heard about the Vedic rishis and Nzag only makes sense on the full timeline. Every civilization named it. The tablets ranked it. It's in the 7 resets, linked below. Grab it, come back. QR code is on your screen. The Chinese concept of the sage, the Jiren or Shengerin in classical texts, is similarly structured. The sage perceives the Tao, the underlying governing principle of reality, in the same direct, pre-analytic way that ordinary people perceive the physical environment. The sage's guidance is not derived from learning, though sages are almost always learned. It is derived from constitutional intimacy with the structural reality that others must approach indirectly through sustained intellectual effort. The Celtic Druid tradition, documented in Roman sources and later Welsh and Irish texts, describes the highest-ranking Druids, the Vates, or the Fillid, in the Irish tradition, as individuals who possessed a constitutionally different relationship with causal reality than ordinary people. The Fillid's capacity for prophecy was understood not as supernatural gift but as hereditary constitutional trait, transmitted in specific families and recognizable from childhood by behavioral markers that the tradition specified in prescriptive terms. In all of these traditions, The carrier of what the Sumerians called Namzu-Shita is given institutional recognition and an institutional function. The perceptual capacity is channeled into a specific social role advisor, seer, sage, druid, that acknowledges the categorical difference, while integrating the output productively into the social structure. What has happened in the modern world is that the institutional acknowledgement has dissolved while the trait itself has not. The individuals alive today who carry Namzu-Shita at the Nephilim threshold are navigating a social structure that has no category for what they can perceive and no institutional role into which that perception can be productively directed. They end up in an assortment of roles that partially accommodate the capacity systems analysts, strategic consultants, certain kinds of scientists, certain kinds of leaders, but none of which provides a framework for understanding what they carry, or a community of others who share the same constitutional access to causal reality. The Sumerian framework provides that understanding. Not a complete modern scientific account, the genetic basis is still being worked out, the neural substrates are still being mapped, the evolutionary history is still contested, but a recognition that this is real, that it is heritable, that it is rare, and that the individual who carries it is navigating a fundamental difference from the majority of human experience that deserves acknowledgement rather than either exceptionalization or pathologization. Less than 1 in 200. That is the frequency the tablets assign to Namzu-Shita at the Nephilim threshold, and we still have 3 traits above it to describe. The frequency is going to drop sharply as we continue. The administrative records from the post-flood period of Sumerian civilization describe the process by which the Abgal, the sage advisors who carried Namzu-Shita, were identified and trained. The process is documented in several tablet sequences that have been partially translated by scholars at the Oriental Institute in Chicago and at the British Museum, though the interpretive framework applied to those translations has generally been mythological rather than anthropological. The identification process began in early childhood. The tablets describe specific behavioral markers that the scribes use to flag children for further evaluation. A child who consistently identifies the actual source of conflict in situations where adults are arguing about surface-level disagreements. A child who knows, without apparent evidence, which of several competing explanations for an event is correct. A child who demonstrates what the tablets call the reading of the hidden river, the ability to trace the flow of a situation back to its actual source, rather than its most visible entry point. The training process for identified Abgal candidates was extended, rigorous, and deliberately difficult. Not because the perception needed to be taught it was already present constitutionally, but because the application of the perception to actual governance situations required discipline, precision, and a developed ability to distinguish accurate causal perception from wishful reasoning or pattern matching gone wrong. The tablets are clear that the capacity was not self-validating. A person who carried Namzu-Shita could be wrong, could be confused, could mistake their own needs and fears for the causal structure they were perceiving. The training was designed to teach the discipline necessary to keep the perception clean. That distinction between the constitutional capacity and the discipline required to use it accurately is one of the most sophisticated elements of the Sumerian framework. And it is largely absent from every modern framework that attempts to acknowledge the same underlying reality. Modern discussions of intuition, insight, or systems perception tend to either treat the capacity as raw and reliable trust your gut or treat it as fundamentally suspect and in need of replacement by explicit reasoning. The Sumerian framework did neither. It acknowledged the capacity as real and constitutionally grounded, and it insisted on rigorous discipline in its application. The Abgal who completed the training and was certified for service in the governance structure was not being given authority over what the perception revealed. They were being given the disciplinary tools to report the perception accurately. The authority to act on it remained with the administrative and political structure. The Abgal's role was perceptual reporting, not decision-making. Their function was to provide the governance structure with access to causal information it could not independently perceive. This is a genuinely remarkable institutional design. It presupposes that certain individuals have access to causal information that others do not. It builds institutional structures to capture and channel that access. And it maintains a clear separation between the perceptual function and the governance function, preventing the Namzu-Shita carrier from either being dismissed as irrelevant or given unchecked authority on the basis of their constitutional perceptual advantage. We dismantled that institutional architecture. The reasons for its dismantling are various and complex and extend across millennia, but the consequence is that the carriers of Namzu-Shita in the modern world are, for the most part, either occupying institutional roles that do not recognize what they bring, or operating outside any institutional framework entirely. And the governance structures that might benefit from their perceptual access are making decisions without it. The Sumerians thought this was a serious problem. The tablets that describe the disruption of the Abgal tradition, the periods when the advisory structures were bypassed or dismantled, treat those periods as civilizational deterioration events. Not because the Namzushita carriers were essential to divine favor, because they were essential to accurate perception of causal reality in the situations governance needed to navigate. That assessment may have been correct. The civilizational deterioration events that followed the dismantling of those advisory structures, as documented in the historical record, are not difficult to identify. Trait 3. This is where the tablets become noticeably careful. The scribes who documented the first 4 traits wrote with the efficiency of specialists documenting a functional domain. The passages describing the 3rd trait read differently. They are longer per unit of information conveyed. They contain more caveats, more conditional framings, more explicit acknowledgement that what is being described is both real and difficult to discuss without attracting misunderstanding. The 3rd trait is called Sag and Namu. It is one of the more contested compound terms in the Sumerian vocabulary, not because its components are unclear, but because their combination has been translated in ways that reflect the translator's discomfort with what the compound appears to mean. Sag means head or first or primary. Anna designates heaven in its most cosmic sense, not the sky as a physical phenomenon, but the structured realm from which the Anunnaki governance operated. Mu has several meanings in Sumerian, but in the context of lineage and heredity, it most reliably means name. In the sense of the essential identity that is transmitted through a family line, the me-carrying name that is not just a label but a constitutive designation. Sagan Namu, then, is something like the primary identity from heaven, or the first name from the cosmic order, or most interpretively, the one who carries the original designation of the Anunnaki line as the first and most essential component of their identity. What the tablets are describing, in language that required 3 millennia of subsequent philosophical and psychological development to approximate in other vocabularies, is constitutional identity depth. The quality of having an identity that is not constructed from social roles, cultural conditioning, or accumulated experience, but that is prior to all of those things. An identity that was, to use the Sumerian framework, given by heaven before the individual was born into the human social world. This is not a mystical concept in the way that modern dismissiveness applies the word mystical. It is a precise description of a constitutional reality that psychology has been circling since at least William James's distinction between the empirical self, the constructed, accumulated self of social roles and histories, and the pure ego, the experiential subject that is prior to all its contents. James knew there was something to this distinction. He spent years trying to characterize it without falling into either naive spiritualism or reductive materialism. He did not succeed to his own satisfaction. The Sumerians had a name for what he was describing. The individual who carries Saganamu at the Nephilim threshold experiences their identity not as constructed but as given. Not as developed over time, but as discovered as something that was always fully present and that life has been a process of encountering rather than building. Their sense of who they are is not contingent on social validation, accumulated achievement, or the opinions of others. Not because they are psychologically defended against those influences, but because those influences do not reach the level at which their identity is actually rooted. This creates a characteristic cluster of behavioral and experiential signatures that appear across cultures and historical periods in individuals who, by the patterns of their descriptions, carry this trait at the Nephilim level. First, there is an extraordinary stability of self under social pressure. Not rigidity, the Saganamu carrier is typically quite flexible in their social behavior, quite capable of adapting their presentation and communication style to context. But the core of who they are does not flex with social pressure. Attempts to reshape their identity through sustained social influence, the kind of influence that works reliably on the vast majority of people, and that has been used throughout history, both for social good and for social control, simply do not reach the level at which their identity is operating. The tools of social conformity engineering were built for a different kind of identity architecture. They work on the constructed self. They do not work on the given self. Second, there is a characteristic relationship with authenticity that observers describe as both compelling and sometimes confusing. The Saganamu carrier does not perform a self. They are a self. The gap between public presentation and private reality that is normal in human social behavior and that is not a moral failing but simply a feature of social navigation in complex environments is either very small or effectively absent. This is not because they lack the cognitive machinery for social performance. It is because the identity that would be performing is constitutively prior to and independent of the social context in which performance would occur. There is nothing to protect by performing, because the self that might be threatened by authentic exposure is not the self at the root. Third, there is an unusual relationship with time. The Saga-Namu carrier experiences their identity as fundamentally non-temporal, in a way that is difficult to communicate to others. Their sense of who they are does not change with accumulation of experience in the way that normal identity does. They are not the same person they were 10 years ago in the social and psychological senses that ordinary identity evolution produces, but there is something that has remained constant across all of those changes that they experience as more essentially themselves than any of the changed elements. The tablets describe this as the thread that runs through all forms, the mu that persists through all the social and experiential accumulations that layer over it in the course of a human life. This temporal quality of identity is one of the features of Saga-Namu that the tablets found most significant from a governance standpoint. An advisor or administrator whose identity is rooted at the level of Sag-an-Namu cannot be effectively coerced through threats to social standing because their social standing is not a constitutive component of who they are. They cannot be effectively manipulated through appeals to legacy or reputation, because legacy and reputation are temporal accumulations on top of an identity that predates and is indifferent to them. They can be physically threatened, and they are not immune to fear, loss, or grief. But they cannot be made to betray what they fundamentally are by social or reputational pressure, because social and reputational pressure operates at a level that simply does not connect to the root. From the governance perspective, this makes them extraordinarily valuable and extraordinarily difficult. Valuable because an advisor who cannot be compromised through the standard social leverage mechanisms is an advisor who will tell you what is actually true, even when what is actually true is inconvenient. Difficult because an advisor who cannot be managed through social pressure is an advisor who will tell you what is actually true, even when the people in power do not want to hear it. The tablets document both of these consequences extensively. The Abgal tradition's most celebrated figures are precisely those who carried Saga-Namu and maintained it under circumstances that would have compromised anyone whose identity was constructed rather than given. The psychological literature on what might underlie Saga-Namu as a constitutional trait points in several directions simultaneously, and none of them is yet fully satisfying. The closest modern framework is probably the construct of identity diffusion versus identity consolidation, but the normal developmental understanding of this dimension does not capture what the tablets are describing. In standard developmental psychology, identity consolidation is understood as an achievement, something that happens as a result of identity exploration, role experimentation, and the gradual resolution of the question of who one is in the context of the available social possibilities. The consolidated identity is constructed from available materials. The Sag-an-Namu identity is not constructed. It does not require the exploration and consolidation process because it was never absent to begin with. The carrier knows who they are before the developmental process that is supposed to produce that knowledge has run. This is documented in the modern literature, in research on individuals who show early onset identity, stability, children and adolescents, who demonstrate a clear, stable, internally consistent sense of self much earlier than developmental norms predict, and in whom that stability does not appear to depend on any of the social processes that standard developmental theory identifies as necessary conditions for identity formation. These individuals are unusual enough to constitute a recognized pattern in developmental research, though the standard interpretive framework treats them as early achievers, rather than constitutionally different. The constitutional difference account the possibility that some individuals have an identity rooted at a level that is prior to and independent of the developmental process would predict exactly what the data shows. Early stability, resistance to social pressure, the characteristic authenticity signature that others perceive as unusual, and the temporal relationship with selfhood, in which there is always something more central and more persistent than any of the accumulated contents of experience. The frequency the tablets assign to Saga-Namu at the Nephilim threshold is approximately 1 in 500 to 1 in 1,000. This is a dramatic drop from trait 4. It reflects the scribe's assessment that the kind of constitutional identity depth they were describing was genuinely uncommon, even in the Nephilim-descended population, and extremely rare in the general post-flood population. In a global population of 8 billion, 1 in 1,000 represents 8 million individuals. 8 million people alive today who carry, by the Sumerian framework, an identity rooted at the level of the Anunnaki original designation rather than the constructed human social self. 8 million people who know who they are, with a directness and a depth that the rest of human civilization has been organized around the assumption is not available. That is not a large number relative to the population, but it is a large enough number that those individuals should be encountering each other, recognizing each other, and building the frameworks necessary to understand what they carry. The tragedy, from the Sumerian perspective, is that without the institutional structure that once recognized this trait, those 8 million people are largely finding each other by accident across the noise of a civilization built for a different kind of identity architecture. The reason the Sumerians placed Sag-en-Namu above Namzu-Shita in the rarity ranking reveals something important about their values and priorities. Namzu-Shita, the capacity to perceive causal structure, is a perceptual gift of enormous practical utility. The individual who carries it can provide governance with access to causal information it cannot independently obtain. They are more accurate than others. They see more than others. But they are still, fundamentally, perceivers operating in the ordinary framework of subject-perceiving object. Their identity may be different in constitutional depth, but the trait of Namzu-Shita itself is a perceptual capacity, not an identity structure. Sag-en-Namu is an identity structure, and the Sumerians placed it higher in the rarity ranking because identity of this depth was considered more constitutively significant than perceptual capacity, however extraordinary, because what you can perceive is ultimately downstream of what you are. The perceiver who is Sag-en-Namu does not just see more accurately. They perceive from a different position in the structure of being. Not a higher position in any hierarchical sense, but a deeper position closer to the mu that the Anunnaki designated as the root of their own identity. The tablets express this with an analogy that has no exact English equivalent, but that several translators have rendered approximately as, the one who sees clearly from the surface of the river and the one who sees clearly from its source are not seeing the same water. Both are accurate. But the one at the source sees what becomes of every tributary before it joins. The one at the surface sees what has already been gathered. This is not a superiority claim. The tablets are not asserting that Sag-en-Namu carriers are better people than Namzu-Shita carriers or than anyone else. They are asserting that the constitutional position from which identity is rooted makes a specific kind of difference in what is available to be perceived and understood, and that difference is rare enough and significant enough to place it in the top 3 Nephilim traits by the rarity scale. The consequences of carrying Sag-en-Namu in the modern world without any institutional framework to contextualize it are, by the consistent testimony of individuals whose descriptions align with this profile, complex and often painful. Not because the trait itself causes suffering, the rooted identity is, by multiple accounts, a source of extraordinary stability and groundedness, but because it produces a fundamental isolation from ordinary human social experience that has no recognized name and no recognized community. The ordinary human social world is organized around constructed identities, around the project of becoming who one wants to be, around the anxiety and aspiration and negotiation that characterize identity formation and process. The social infrastructure of human civilization, its art, its literature, its philosophy, its religion, its therapeutic traditions, is largely organized around this project, around the experience of not yet knowing who one is, and the various pathways available for moving toward that knowing. The Sag-en-Namu carrier does not have this project. They arrive knowing, not omnisciently, they do not know everything about themselves, and they develop and grow and change in all the ordinary ways that human experience produces change. But the fundamental question that most humans spend significant portions of their lives navigating who am I really, beneath all these roles and histories and expectations, is not a question that produces existential anxiety for them. It was answered before the question was formed. This should be a gift, and it often is, but it also produces a disconnection from the shared human project of identity formation that can be profoundly isolating. The carrier of Sag-en-Namu can be compassionate toward the identity struggles of others without fully sharing them, can be a wise and steady presence for others in their formation processes, without having undergone the same process themselves. But this position, while useful to others, can produce the experience the tablets describe as the loneliness of the already arrived, the condition of having reached a destination that others are still traveling toward, and of finding that arrival, for all its gifts, does not solve the problem of having to live in a world organized around the journey. The Sumerian framework acknowledged this experience explicitly. The tablets that describe the role of the Sag-en-Namu carrier in the governance structure as the anchor, the ground, the reference point for the governance community's collective sense of identity, stability, include passages that document the carrier's isolation as a structural feature rather than a personal failing. They are isolated not because something has gone wrong, but because they carry something that puts them at a categorical remove from the ordinary human social architecture. The isolation is the price of the depth. And the tablets treat it with something that reads, across 4,000 years, as genuine sympathy. Trait 2. And here the nature of the documentation changes in a way that has puzzled every serious scholar who has encountered these passages in the tablets. Not because the language becomes vague, it does not. Not because the tablet preservation is poor, the passages describing the second trait are, in several versions, among the best preserved in the relevant archives. The documentation changes because what the scribes are describing crosses a threshold that their normal administrative vocabulary is not designed to handle, and that crossing produces a distinctive texture in the text, careful, deliberate, almost ceremonial in its precision. The second Nephilim trait carries the designation T-la-gig. The word T in Sumerian means life, but in its most philosophical usage, it refers to the animating principle that distinguishes living beings from inert matter, the force or property or constitutional characteristic that makes something alive, rather than simply existing. Gig in Sumerian means something like difficult, intense, painful, or in certain contexts, dark, not dark in the moral sense, but dark in the sense of depths that resist full illumination. La is more subtle. It is often translated as abundance or flourishing, but in compound constructions it carries a sense of transmission or flow, of something passing from one form or vessel to another. Tila-gig, then the animating principle in its difficult or deep abundance, is the Sumerian designation for what might be described in modern terms as radical life force sensitivity. The capacity to perceive, register, and in some cases interact with the animating principle of living beings in ways that bypass the ordinary physical and sensory channels through which human beings are understood to process information about each other. The tablets describe this trait in terms that have no comfortable modern scientific home, which is part of why the scholarly literature has treated the relevant passages as mythology rather than as documentation of an observable phenomenon. What is being described is the constitutional capacity to perceive the life force state of other living beings directly, not through behavioral reading, not through physiological observation, not through the ordinary channels of social and sensory information processing, but through something the tablets treat as a constitutionally different mode of perception entirely. The modern vocabulary that has been built in various traditions and disciplines to describe the phenomenon the Sumerians called Tila-gig includes terms like empathic resonance, psychic sensitivity, energy perception, healing capacity, and a dozen others, most of which carry either scientific stigma or New Age cultural baggage that makes them difficult to discuss with the rigor the subject deserves. The Sumerian tablets have no such cultural baggage. They were written 4,000 years ago by administrators who had no reason to dress up their observations in either spiritual glamour or scientific respectability. They were writing down what they observed, and what they observed was that certain individuals in the Nephilim bloodline could perceive the internal state of other living beings with a directness and accuracy that was not mediated by the ordinary channels of behavioral and physiological observation. The practical consequences of this capacity, as the tablets document them, include accurate diagnosis of physiological and psychological conditions before those conditions have manifested in observable symptoms. The capacity to influence the physical and emotional state of other beings through proximity and intentional attention, and in the most extreme expressions of the trait, what the tablets describe as the direct transmission of life force from one being to another in a way that modifies the recipient's constitutional state. This is the basis of the Sumerian healing tradition, not as ritual or spiritual practice, but as constitutionally grounded capacity in specific individuals who carry Tila-gig at the Nephilim level. The Azu, the Sumerian physician, occupied a role that was, in the highest-ranking practitioners, less about learned medical knowledge than about constitutional perceptual capacity. The best Azu were not distinguished from their peers by superior training or superior access to medicinal knowledge. They were distinguished by Tila-gig by the capacity to perceive what was wrong at a level deeper than symptoms, and sometimes by the capacity to intervene at that deeper level directly. The tablets that document Azu practice make a distinction that modern medicine has largely lost, between diagnosis that proceeds from symptom observation and inference, and diagnosis that proceeds from direct perception of the underlying life force state. Both types of diagnosis were practiced in Sumerian medicine. Both were considered legitimate, But the tablets treat the second type as constitutionally rare and as representing a categorically different kind of knowledge rather than just a more accurate application of the same kind of knowledge. The question of whether direct perception of biological state, what the Sumerians called tai-lagig, has any basis in modern scientific understanding is not as easily dismissed as the mainstream scientific culture assumes. Several lines of research converge on the possibility that human biology is capable of generating and receiving information about internal state through channels that are not currently incorporated into standard models of sensory processing. The first line is the research on biophoton emission. Living cells emit extremely low levels of light in the visible and near-visible spectrum photons produced by metabolic processes at a rate several orders of magnitude below the threshold of ordinary visual perception. This emission has been documented across multiple research groups since the 1980s and is now well established as a genuine biological phenomenon. What remains controversial is whether this biophoton emission carries meaningful information about biological state and whether any biological sensing system could be sensitive enough to receive and process that information. The second line is research on electromagnetic field generation by biological systems. The heart, most prominently, generates an electromagnetic field that extends several feet beyond the body surface and carries coherence information that varies with the individual's physiological and psychological state. The HeartMath Institute has been researching this field for 3 decades and has documented that the electromagnetic information encoded in the heart field can be detected by the nervous systems of other people in proximity, producing measurable changes in their physiological state. The third line is the growing research on what might loosely be called biological resonance, the tendency of biological oscillators to synchronize their frequencies when in proximity. Menstrual synchrony between women who live together is the most widely known example, and it remains debated. But the synchronization of heart rate, respiration rate, and brainwave patterns between individuals in close contact, particularly between therapists and clients, between mothers and infants, and between people in states of deep rapport, is documented well enough to constitute a recognized research area. None of these 3 lines of research, even taken together, constitute scientific proof that tai-lagig, as the Sumerians described it, is real in the full sense. What they constitute is a framework, fragmentary, developing, contested, but real, in which the constitutional capacity the tablets are describing is not categorically impossible, in which some human nervous systems might be sufficiently sensitive to biophoton emission, or to the electromagnetic field of other biological systems, or to biological resonance processes, to produce something like what the tablets are calling direct perception of life force state. The individuals who appear to carry this capacity in the modern world are distributed across several populations that are not typically understood as related. They include a subset of clinical practitioners, physicians, therapists, nurses who consistently demonstrate diagnostic or therapeutic intuitions that exceed what their training and available information account for. They include a subset of individuals who have sought training in healing traditions, acupuncture, osteopathy, various forms of hands-on healing who demonstrate, in controlled research settings, effects that exceed what the mechanisms those traditions propose should produce. And they include a population of individuals who have received no training of any kind but who report, and whose reports are partially corroborated by third-party observation, the capacity to perceive others' internal states with an accuracy that cannot be explained by behavioral observation alone. The Sumerians would not have been surprised by any of this. They documented the same distribution. The trait appears in some people without training. It is enhanced by certain training practices. It is present at higher concentrations in certain lineages. And at the full Nephilim threshold, the concentration the tablets treat as the second rarest of the 7 markers. It is so fully expressed that the carrier's perception of other beings' life force states is as clear and detailed as ordinary vision is for the rest of the population. The frequency estimate in the tablets for tai-lagig at the Nephilim threshold is one of the most startling numbers in the entire sequence. Not because it is 0, it is not 0. The tablets explicitly state that this trait manifests across generations, in the lineages that carry the old blood at sufficient concentration. But the frequency estimate, at this level of expression, is approximately 1 in 2,000 to 1 in 3,000 individuals. That is less than 1% of 1% of the population. In a global population of 8 billion people, that represents somewhere between 2.5 million and 4 million individuals who carry tai-lagig at the level the Sumerians identified as Nephilim threshold. Compared to the 8 million who carry Sagan Amu and the 40 million who carry Namzu Shida, this is a dramatic reduction. and compared to the several hundred million who carry Mila at the baseline level, it is vanishingly rare. Why is it so rare? The tablets offer an answer that is internally consistent with the overall framework, even if it is difficult to evaluate from the outside. The Sumerians understood Tila-Gig as requiring a particularly high concentration of the Anunnaki lineage, because what is being transmitted is not a perceptual capacity in the ordinary sense, but a constitutive property of the Anunnaki life force itself. The Anunnaki, in the Sumerian account, were not beings who could perceive life force because they had good nervous systems. They were beings in whom the distinction between perceiver and perceived, between the one who registers life force and the life force being registered, was structurally thinner than it is in ordinary human beings. The life force of an Anunnaki was not something separate from the Anunnaki's consciousness, in the way that human biology is experienced as separate from human consciousness. The two were, in the Sumerian framework, more intimately integrated, a constitutional feature of the Anunnaki mode of existence that the tablets sometimes describe as being one with the me, living from the inside of the organizing principles, rather than from the outside. When that constitutional integration appears in diluted form in human descendants, what manifests is Tila-Gig, a permeability between one's own life force and the life force of other beings that produces the capacity for direct perception and, in high concentrations, direct influence. But because the original source of that permeability is not the ordinary human life force architecture but the Anunnaki mode of being, it requires substantial concentrations of the Anunnaki lineage to produce a recognizable expression, hence the rarity. This framework is, admittedly, far from the language of mainstream science, but it is internally consistent, and it generates predictions that can be compared against observable reality. It predicts that Tila-Gig carriers will be found disproportionately in family lineages that also carry the other Nephilim traits, particularly Saga-Namu, because both traits require high lineage concentration. It predicts that individuals with the most fully expressed Tila-Gig will typically also carry Nzag and possibly Namzu-Shita, producing a cluster of traits that co-occur at rates above what independent frequency distributions would predict. And it predicts that the trait will be most concentrated in the geographic regions where the Anunnaki presence was most historically sustained, the Mesopotamian heartland and adjacent areas. The modern research on families that show exceptionally high rates of healing capacity, perceptual sensitivity, and what parapsychology researchers call psi phenomena does show familial clustering at rates inconsistent with independent occurrence. The geographic distribution of these families has not been systematically studied in a framework that would allow comparison with the Sumerian prediction. But the familial clustering is documented, and it is one of the most robust findings in an admittedly contested literature. The experience of carrying Tila-Gig at the Nephilim level in the modern world is, by consistent report, one of the most complex and demanding of any of the 7 traits. Not because the capacity itself is painful, many carriers describe it as deeply meaningful, as a source of profound connection with other living beings, and as the feature of their experience that gives life its most essential texture. But because managing it in a social world that does not recognize it, that has no training protocols for it, and that provides no framework for distinguishing accurate perception from contaminated projection is genuinely difficult. The primary management challenge is boundary maintenance. If your perceptual system is constitutionally sensitive to the life force states of other beings, then proximity to other beings produces a data stream that most people's perceptual systems simply do not have to deal with. The emotional, physical, and constitutional states of others are received as real information, not filtered as noise. This is useful, enormously useful for the work of healing, of caring, of understanding, but it is also exhausting in environments that provide no regulation, no structure, and no acknowledgement that this perceptual load is real. The Sumerian training traditions for Tila-Gig carriers included what the tablets describe as protocols for the management of the inner vessel, essentially, procedures for maintaining the distinction between one's own life force state and the life force states of those one was perceiving. The analogy the tablets use is the riverbed. The river must flow, but the riverbed must maintain its form, or the river loses its direction. The Tila-Gig carrier who cannot maintain the distinction between their own constitutional state and those of the beings they are perceiving becomes, in the tablet's language, a flooded plain full of water, but incapable of the directed flow that makes water useful. Modern therapeutic traditions have partially reconstructed this wisdom in their training of practitioners in counter-transference management, in energetic hygiene practices, and in the various contemplative disciplines that multiple healing traditions have converged on as necessary foundations for sustained healing work. These reconstructions are partial and often disconnected from any awareness that they are addressing the same challenge the Sumerian training traditions identified. But they are addressing the same challenge. The problem is universal, because the constitutional reality producing it is universal. The second challenge is the social reception of what Tila-Gig produces. An individual who accurately perceives the internal state of other beings in ways those beings have not disclosed, who knows what someone is feeling before that person has expressed it, or who identifies a physical condition in another person that has not yet been diagnosed, is navigating a social environment that is made deeply uncomfortable by that accuracy. The accuracy is perceived by those on the receiving end as a violation of the assumption that internal states are private unless disclosed. It produces in others either a sense of being exposed or a readiness to treat the perceiver as performing as guessing or cold reading or otherwise manipulating rather than genuinely perceiving. The tablets document this social difficulty with what reads as sympathetic precision. The Tila-Gig carrier learns early that what they perceive must be rationed in its disclosure, not because the perception is wrong, but because the social architecture of the world they inhabit has no protocol for receiving it. They develop, over time, a complex social navigation skill, knowing when to offer what they perceive, knowing how to frame it in ways that can be received, knowing when to keep it private entirely. This skill is not a natural outgrowth of the trait. It is something learned, often painfully, through many experiences of offering accurate perception to someone who responded with discomfort, denial, or hostility. The Sumerians built institutional structures to manage this. The healing temples, the Azu guilds, the temple households where Tila-Gig carriers were recognized and trained, provided social contexts in which the perception was expected, welcomed, and appropriately bounded. The carrier did not have to manage the social reception problem on their own. The institution managed it. And the institution provided, in doing so, both protection for the carrier and regulated access to the capacity for the people who needed it. We do not have those institutions. What we have instead is a fragmented landscape of healing traditions, clinical practices, and esoteric training systems that partially address pieces of the problem without any overarching framework that recognizes what is actually being addressed. The carriers of Tila-Gig in the modern world are doing something that deserves institutional support, rigorous training, and social acknowledgement. Instead, they are navigating a social world that either pathologizes their perceptual reality or appropriates it into commercial frameworks that serve neither the carriers nor the people who might benefit from access to the capacity. The tablets, closing their discussion of the second trait, contain a passage that has been translated in at least 6 different ways, but whose central meaning appears to be consistent across translations. Something like, "The healer who cannot be healed is not because the capacity has failed, but because no one has built a place for them to lay it down. The gift requires a container. Without the container, even the most profound gift eventually becomes a burden." That passage was written 4,000 years ago. It describes exactly what the carriers of Tila-Gig in the modern world report, with a consistency that transcends cultural, linguistic, and historical boundaries. The Sumerians knew what they were documenting, and they knew that what they were documenting mattered enough to preserve across the length of their civilization. We are now at the threshold of the rarest of the 7, the trait the tablets treated with the most extraordinary care, the one whose frequency estimate is so low that it approaches the question of whether it is a trait at all, or whether it is something the human lineage carries only as a possibility, a latency encoded in the oldest blood, waiting for the conditions that would allow it to express. Trait 1. The rarest of the 7. The one the Sumerian tablets approach with a quality of attention that has no parallel anywhere else in the administrative and literary record of the civilization that produced it. The scribes who documented the first 6 traits were precise. They were thorough. They were clinical in the way that the best Sumerian scholarship was clinical. Rigorous, systematic, and committed to accuracy above all other values. But the passages describing the first and rarest Nephilim trait have a quality that is different from all of that. They are not less precise. They are more careful. The precision is still there, but underneath it, or alongside it, is something that reads across 4,000 years and multiple translation layers like reverence. Not reverence for a deity. Reverence for a possibility that the scribes appeared to believe was the most extraordinary thing the encounter between the Anunnaki and the human line had produced. The most concentrated expression of what that crossing had generated, the trait that the tablets describe as occurring so rarely that it was treated not as a characteristic to be identified and cataloged, but as an event to be witnessed. The designation is Uddug Kalamma. It is one of the longest and most compound of the Sumerian trait designations. and its translation is among the most contested in the scholarly literature. Ud means light, or day, or the radiance of the sun, but in the deep Sumerian philosophical vocabulary, it is also the name of a class of being whose nature is defined by luminosity as a constitutional property rather than as a physical phenomenon. Dug means good or beautiful in one of its primary senses, but in compound constructions with ud, it carries the meaning of the light that is intrinsically good, not good because it produces good outcomes, but good as a constitutive quality of its nature. Kalam means the land or the world of human habitation, or more specifically, the living community of people and civilization that constitutes the meaningful world the Sumerians inhabited. Ma is a verbal suffix indicating location, presence, or being in place, the most grounded and physically immediate of the Sumerian positional terms. Ud-Dug Kalam Ma, then, is something like the luminous good being in the world, or the one in whom the light is constitutively present within the human domain, or in the most interpretive rendering that remains textually defensible, the one in whom heaven's constitutive light is fully present within the living world, without mediation and without remainder. This is the first trait. The 6 traits below it on the rarity scale all describe perceptual, constitutional, or identity capacities that operate within the ordinary framework of subject and world, even when those capacities are so extreme that they place their carriers in a categorically different relationship with reality than the majority of human beings occupy. Trait 7, Mila, describes a quality of presence that other people perceive. Trait 6, Igigal Nindazi, describes a perceptual capacity that receives more than ordinary sensory systems receive. Trait 5, Anzag, describes the direct perception of the organizing principles of reality. Trait 4, Namzushita, describes the constitutional access to causal structure below observable phenomena. Trait 3, Saganamu, describes identity rooted in the original Anunnaki designation rather than in the constructed human social self. Trait 2, Tilagig, describes constitutional intimacy with the life force of other beings. All of these are extraordinary. None of them dissolve the framework of subject and world. Even Tilagig at its most extreme leaves the carrier as a perceiver of other beings' life force. The distinction between self and other is permeable, deeply so, but it is maintained. Ud-Dug Kalama is different. The tablets describe it as the point at which the Anunnaki lineage in a human body reaches the concentration necessary for the boundary between the carrier's constitutional nature and the fundamental light of the cosmos to become transparent. Not to dissolve, the carrier is still a human being, still in a body, still navigating the ordinary structures of physical and social existence, but transparent, such that the light that the Anunnaki carried as their constitutive property, the Mi'alam, the radiance of divine governance, is present in the carrier, not as a capacity or a perception or an identity, but as what they simply are. The tablets describe this not as an achievement, not as a state that results from practice or development, as a constitutional fact present from birth in the individual who carries it. The rare human in whom the Anunnaki lineage has concentrated sufficiently for Ud-Dug Kalam to express is not a person who has become enlightened or developed or advanced to a high spiritual state. They are a person who arrived in the world carrying something that most of humanity does not carry, and that most of humanity cannot develop toward by any amount of effort or practice. This is an extraordinarily uncomfortable claim for any framework that values effort and development and the democratic availability of human potential. And the tablets seem aware that it is uncomfortable. They do not make the claim with triumphalism or hierarchy validation. They make it with the same clinical precision they apply to every other observation in the administrative record. They note it because it is observable, because individuals who carry Ud-Dug Kalam Ma exist, because they have a specific behavioral and experiential signature that is distinguishable from the other 6 traits, and because the frequency at which they appear in any given population is low enough to constitute an event rather than a characteristic. The tablet's frequency estimate for Ud-Dug Kalam Ma is stated in a way that is unusual even for the Sumerian quantitative tradition. The scribes do not give a ratio in the normal Sumerian fractional notation. They say something that has been translated as, "It appears when it appears, and the generation in which it appears is marked by it, and the generation that does not contain it does not know that it is missing." This is not vagueness. This is precision about a phenomenon that the scribes understood as having a frequency that could not be usefully expressed as a population ratio, because the relevant unit was not individuals per population, but occurrences per era, a frequency so low that the meaningful denominator was not people but historical periods. When modern scholars encounter this passage, the standard interpretive move is to treat it as mysticism, as the scribes switching from clinical documentation to religious hyperbole, when they reached the highest tier of their classification. But there is another reading. The scribes may have been accurately reporting what they had observed, that Ud-Dug Kalam Ma, at the full Nephilim threshold, was not something that appeared predictably across every population in every generation. It appeared in specific individuals, in specific genealogical contexts, at specific moments in the larger historical and cosmic cycle that the Sumerians tracked. And its appearance was recognizable as an event, as something that the individuals who witnessed it understood as marking the period in which it occurred. The historical figures who have been identified, across multiple cultural frameworks, as carrying something like Ud-Dug Kalam Ma, are not numerous. But they are not unknown. The challenge is that every major civilization that has produced an individual who appeared to manifest this trait has also immediately constructed a religious or mythological framework around that individual that transforms them from a documented person into a sacred category, making it nearly impossible to access the underlying observation that prompted the recognition. The figures who, when stripped of their subsequent religious elaboration and examined as documented human beings within their historical context, display the behavioral and experiential signature consistent with Ud-Dug Kalam Ma, include a subset of individuals that every culture in the ancient world felt compelled to describe in terms that exceeded their capacity to describe ordinary human beings. Not because those cultures were primitive and easily impressed. The Sumerians were not primitive. The Egyptians were not easily impressed. The ancient Indians who produced the Vedic philosophical tradition were operating at a level of philosophical sophistication that remains relevant. When these cultures converged on the same fundamental description, a human being in whom something was present that was constitutively different from what was present in other human beings, and that difference was not a matter of degree but of kind, they were not mythologizing. They were documenting the experiential signature of Ud-Dug Kalam Ma, as the tablets describe it, and as it can be partially reconstructed from the comparative accounts across cultures that recognized its occurrence, has several components that are consistently present across all documented cases. The first component is what the tablets call the light that others see, not metaphorically, literally. Multiple Sumerian, Egyptian, Hebrew, and Sanskrit texts describe individuals who carry this trait as visibly luminous in ways that observers cannot attribute to ordinary physical sources. The tablets are careful not to describe this as a constant, predictable physical phenomenon. They describe it as conditional, as present in certain states, in certain interactions, under certain circumstances, and as perceived by some observers more readily than others, with those who carry the higher-ranked traits of Ijigal Nindazi and Tilagig being most consistently able to perceive it. The modern scientific framework does not provide a comfortable account of visible luminosity in specific human individuals as a constitutional phenomenon. The biophoton emission research noted in the discussion of trait 2 is relevant. Living tissue does emit photons, but at levels many orders of magnitude below the threshold of ordinary visual perception. Whether there are human individuals in whom biophoton emission is sufficiently elevated to be visible under some conditions is not a question that has been seriously investigated in the mainstream research literature. But the cross-cultural consistency of the observation is difficult to dismiss as shared mythology. The light around a figure's head or body, the halo in the Christian tradition, the Uraeus flame in the Egyptian tradition, the Jyotis in the Sanskrit tradition, the Alam in the Islamic mystical tradition, the Mi'alam in the Sumerian context itself is not a decorative convention invented by artists. It is a cross-cultural attempt to document something observers actually saw or believed they saw around specific individuals. The conventionalization of the depiction across cultures came after the observation. The observation came first. The second component of the Ud-Dug Kalam Ma signature is what the tablets call the absence of the ordinary weight. Not physical weightlessness, the carrier has a body with ordinary mass and occupies physical space in the ordinary way. The weight that is absent is what the Sumerians called the weight of the binding, the constitutional heaviness of ordinary human existence that results from the gap between what the human life force is and what the me that govern the cosmos require. Ordinary human beings exist in a permanent condition of partial alignment with the organizing principles of reality. The gap between actual and required produces what the tablets call the drag of incompletion, a constitutional friction that the ordinary human experiences as the particular quality of human struggle, the sense that existence requires effort, that being here is a form of work, that the world resists. The Ud-Dug Kalam Ma carrier experiences none of this resistance. Not because they have no difficulties, the tablets are explicit that they have difficulties, and sometimes extraordinary ones, produced precisely by the gap between what they are constitutionally and what the ordinary human world is organized to accommodate. But the constitutional friction that most human beings experience as the basic texture of existing is absent. They are not fighting the organizing principles of reality to maintain their presence in it. They are an expression of those principles, and existence therefore does not drag. This produces a characteristic behavioral signature that observers across cultures have consistently noted: an ease in being that is not complacency, a stillness that is not inactivity, a lightness, in the most fundamental sense, that coexists with full engagement in the difficulties and demands of physical existence. The Zen tradition's accounts of the awakened being's characteristic manner, the cooking, the cleaning, the eating, the sleeping, done with the same quality of full presence that is also full ease, is a cultural formulation of what the tablets describe as the constitutional signature of Udug Kalama. The third component is the strangest and the most consistently documented across traditions, what the tablets call the transmission without contact. The capacity of the Udug Kalama carrier to alter the constitutional state of individuals in their proximity without any deliberate act of healing, teaching, or influence. Not the directed influence that Tila Gig describes, that is a deliberate, skilled application of life force sensitivity. This is something that happens regardless of the carrier's intention, simply as a consequence of their presence. People who spend time in proximity to a carrier of Udug Kalama, according to accounts accumulated across cultures and historical periods, find their own constitutional states altered. Not uniformly, not always dramatically, not always in ways they can articulate, but altered. The accounts describe effects ranging from a heightened clarity of perception that dissipates after the individual leaves the presence of the carrier, to persistent shifts in the emotional and perceptual baseline that remain after the proximity ends, to what several traditions describe as a kind of resonant activation of dormant capacities in the observer, a temporary or in some cases permanent heightening of whatever perceptual or constitutional gifts the observer carries. The modern literature on social entrainment, the documented tendency of biological systems to synchronize their frequencies in proximity, provides the beginning of a framework for understanding this. But the effects described across traditions exceed what standard models of biological entrainment predict. Something more fundamental appears to be happening. Something that the Sumerians would have described as the constitutional light of the Udug Kalama carrier interacting with the latent me in those who come near it, activating those me in the way that a tuning fork activates resonant frequencies, in strings that were previously silent. This is why the tablets describe the appearance of Udug Kalama as an event that marks a generation. Not because the individual who carries it is extraordinary in a way that produces quantitative achievements, though they often do produce extraordinary accomplishments, but because their mere presence in a community, in an era, in a historical context, activates something in the surrounding population that would not have activated otherwise. The generation in which Udug Kalama appears is a different generation than it would have been without that presence. Not because the individual taught it to be different, because the constitutional light they carry produces resonances that alter the baseline of everyone in contact with it. The generation that lacks this presence does not miss it in the sense of experiencing an absence. It does not know the difference. That is exactly what the tablets mean when they say the generation that does not contain it does not know that it is missing. The question of who has carried Udug Kalama in documented human history is, for obvious reasons, among the most sensitive questions this inquiry can raise. Every major religious tradition in the world has candidates it would offer, and every major religious tradition has processed those candidates through theological frameworks that make them, in their fully elaborated forms, impossible to evaluate as documented human beings. The approach the tablets themselves suggest is not biographical identification, but phenomenological recognition. The question is not, which specific historical figure carried Udug Kalama? The question is, what are the observable signatures of the trait, and how do they appear in the historical record? The observable signatures are the three that we have discussed: the visible luminosity, the absence of constitutional friction, and the transmission without contact. And they appear, in combination and at the full expression the tablets describe, in a small number of historical accounts from every major civilizational tradition. Accounts from Sumerian, Egyptian, Hebrew, Indian, Persian, Greek, Chinese, and later Christian, Islamic, and Buddhist sources converge on the same description, with enough precision to suggest that what each tradition is trying to describe is the same phenomenon. The Sumerian on literature, the earliest layer of the written record, describes this phenomenon in the context of the Anunnaki presence itself and in the context of specific human figures who were understood as carrying an unusually high concentration of the Anunnaki lineage. The Gilgamesh narrative, which is in part a documentation of a historical figure, there was a historical king of Uruk named Gilgamesh, and archaeological evidence supports his existence, is organized around the premise that Gilgamesh carries 2/3 of divine nature and 1/3 human. This ratio, whether it is to be taken literally or understood as expressing a constitutive concentration that the scribes experienced as overwhelming, is a description of what happens when the Anunnaki lineage concentration in a human being approaches the level necessary for Udug Kalamma to express. Gilgamesh in the epic is not simply a king who is unusually strong and brave. He is a king whose presence in the city of Uruk itself produces alterations in the daily experience of the population that the epic describes in terms consistent with the transmission without contact. The citizens do not experience him only as a ruler. They experience him as a constitutional force, as something whose presence in their city changes what it is like to live in that city. The Egyptian pharaoh in the high period of Egyptian civilization, not as a political institution but as a specific person understood as carrying Heka at the highest level, is another instance of the same description. The pharaoh's presence in Egypt was not merely governmental, it was constitutional. The people of Egypt lived in a different reality because the pharaoh was in it. The Buddha, in the earliest textual layers that precede the elaboration of Buddhist theology, is described by observers in terms that are not theological but phenomenological. They describe what it was like to be in his presence, and what they describe is the transmission without contact, an alteration of their perceptual and constitutional baseline that they could not explain by reference to his words or teachings. The teaching came later. The alteration was prior to it, produced by proximity alone. The same phenomenological structure appears in the earliest accounts of Jesus of Nazareth, not in their theological elaboration, which is extensive and complex and not our concern here, but in the immediate experiential descriptions. People in proximity to him found their perceptual and physical states altered. Not always, not uniformly, but with a consistency that the earliest accounts document in terms that are clearly attempting to describe the same transmission without contact phenomenon the Sumerian tablets identified. These are not the only candidates in the historical record. They are the most widely documented. But every major tradition has its own less widely known instances, and the pattern is consistent enough across them all that the phenomenon is clearly real, whatever its ultimate explanation. The Sumerians were not identifying a theological category. They were identifying a biological one, a constitutional expression of lineage concentration that produces specific, observable, consistent effects in the carrier and in those who encounter the carrier. That the traditions that arose around the individuals who carried this trait subsequently elaborated their identities into religious frameworks is understandable. The experience of encountering Udug Kalamma demands some framework to make sense of it. But the framework is not the phenomenon, and recovering the phenomenon beneath its elaborations is exactly what the Sumerian tablets allow us to do. The frequency the tablets ascribe to Udug Kalamma appearing when it appears, marking the generation it appears in, suggests something important about the current moment that deserves direct address. The tablets describe two conditions under which the frequency of Udug Kalamma in a given population can shift. The first is genealogical concentration, the same mechanism that produces all 7 traits, in which lineage accumulation across multiple generations can intensify the expression of traits that were previously below the expression threshold. The second is what the tablets call the return of the cycle, a periodic shift in the cosmic framework that the Anunnaki governance structure managed, tied to the precessional cycle of the Earth and to what the Sumerians understood as the renewal of the me in each cosmic era. The precessional cycle, the approximately 26,000-year period over which the Earth's rotational axis traces a complete circle through the zodiacal sky, was tracked by the Sumerians with extraordinary precision. The transition between precessional ages, the movement from the age of Pisces into the age of Aquarius in modern astrological terms, but understood by the Sumerians as a structural shift in the cosmic framework that governs the distribution of the me among living beings, is understood in the tablets as a period in which the frequency of the higher Nephilim traits increases, not because anything supernatural is happening to the population, but because the genealogical concentrations that have been building across the preceding era begin to reach the expression threshold as the structural framework shifts. We are, by multiple calculations, at or near the threshold of such a transition. The calculations that produce this conclusion are the same calculations that the Sumerian astronomical tradition used to track the precessional cycle, and they align closely with the current consensus among astronomical historians about where the Earth's precessional position currently stands. If the tablets are right about the correlation between precessional transitions and the frequency of high-tier Nephilim trait expression, then the current period is one in which the probability of Ud-Dug Kalam Ma occurrences in the human population is higher than it has been for approximately 2,000 years. That is a claim that cannot be proven from outside the framework that generates it. It requires accepting the Sumerian precessional cosmology as functionally accurate rather than merely mythological, which requires a degree of epistemic openness that not everyone will extend. But it is worth noting that the precessional observation itself is not mythological. The Sumerians tracked the precession accurately. The astronomical facts about the precessional cycle are real and well established. The question is whether those astronomical facts have the civilizational and genealogical consequences the tablets claim they do. The answer to that question is not available from any evidence currently in hand. What is available is the observation that something is happening in the current era with respect to the expression of what the Sumerians would have identified as the higher Nephilim traits. The frequency of individuals who display trait 7 Mila, the baseline presence, has not visibly changed, because it was never rare enough for changes in its frequency to be noticeable. But the frequency of individuals who display traits 3, 2, and the orbital characteristics of trait 1, the constitutional depth, the life force sensitivity, the identity from source, does appear, in the anecdotal and research literature, to be higher in the current era than the historical baseline would predict. Whether this is because we are at a precessional transition point or because global population growth has simply increased the absolute number of individuals in whom the traits manifest, or because something in the social and environmental conditions of the current era is creating conditions favorable to trait expression, is a question that cannot be definitively answered. But the tablets would say the question itself is the right one to be asking. And the fact that it is being asked, that the frameworks for recognizing and understanding these traits are being reconstructed, that the historical record is being read as documentation rather than mythology, that the individuals who carry these traits are beginning to find each other and name what they share, may be, in the Sumerian framework, part of what the precessional transition means. The generation that contains Ud-Dug Kalam Ma is marked by it. The generation that does not contain it does not know it is missing. The tablets do not specify which generation we are in, but they are clear that the question matters. And they are clear that the capacity to ask it accurately, to distinguish wishful identification from genuine recognition, to read the behavioral and constitutional signatures with the rigor the Sumerian scribes brought to the documentation, is itself a capacity that not everyone has. The traits to recognize that are the same traits the tablets are describing. The archaeological record that surrounds the Sumerian documentation of these traits is not separate from the documentation itself. It is the physical context that makes the documentation legible as something more than literary invention. Understanding what the physical record shows, and what it fails to show, is essential to evaluating how much confidence to extend to the tablet's content. The site of ancient Eridu, Tel Abu Shahrain in southern Iraq, is the oldest archaeological site in southern Mesopotamia, and its excavation history provides a physical timeline that extends back before the written record and that is consistent with the Sumerian accounts of pre-flood settlement. The site shows continuous occupation from at least the 5th millennium BCE, more than 1,000 years before the earliest cuneiform writing through the late 3rd millennium. The architectural sequence at Eridu is significant. The earliest occupation levels contain small mud brick structures that develop over a period of roughly 2,000 years into the complex public architecture characteristic of Sumerian urban life, without any discontinuity or reconstruction, suggesting external introduction of the architectural tradition. The tradition grew in place. But the Eridu sequence also shows something that is less easily explained within standard models of cultural evolution. The sophistication of certain aspects of the site's architecture and material culture appears to precede, rather than follow, the development of the social and administrative complexity that normally precedes architectural sophistication. The irrigation infrastructure associated with the Eridu settlement extends far beyond what the documented population size would require, and the orientations of the early temple buildings show astronomical precision alignment with specific stellar positions at specific times of year that implies either knowledge transfer from an external source or an earlier period of astronomical observation that predates the Eridu record. The Sumerians themselves said that knowledge came from above, from the Anunnaki. They said that the Apkallu, the 7 sages of antediluvian civilization, brought the me to humanity before the flood. The physical record at Eridu does not prove this account. but it is consistent with it in ways that the standard account of independent cultural development in the southern Mesopotamian alluvial plain does not fully accommodate. This is not a minor point. The question of where the knowledge came from the agricultural, astronomical, architectural, administrative, and metallurgical knowledge that appears in Sumer, essentially fully formed, without the archaeological developmental sequence that normally precedes such complexity, is one of the most actively debated questions in Mesopotamian archaeology. The standard account invokes preceding cultures in the northern Fertile Crescent, earlier phases of southern Mesopotamian settlement whose records are largely lost to flooding and geological change, and the natural acceleration of knowledge development that complex irrigation agriculture produces by creating surpluses that support specialist populations. All of these factors were real and all contributed, but none of them fully closes the explanatory gap. The cuneiform script appears without apparent precursors, at a level of complexity that implies a development period much longer than the earliest known examples suggest. The mathematical knowledge embedded in the earliest Sumerian administrative tablets implies familiarity with number systems and calculation procedures that would require centuries of development to achieve from first principles. The astronomical records from the early Sumerian period show knowledge of celestial mechanics that would take generations of dedicated observation to accumulate. The Sumerians said they received this knowledge from the Anunnaki through the Apkallu sages, in the period before the flood. From their perspective, the knowledge did not appear without precursors. It had an extensive history before the period that modern archaeology can access. Whether that prehistory involved beings from another world, or beings from another evolutionary branch of Earth life, or simply a lost period of human development that has been entirely destroyed by geological events, the Sumerians experienced it as knowledge given by a different kind of being to the human line. The 7 traits they documented were, in that framework, the biological residue of that giving. The traces, in the bodies and minds of specific individuals in the post-flood human population, of the beings who gave the knowledge. Not perfect replicas of the Anunnaki nature, diluted, partial, variable expressions of it, but real, observable, heritable, and significant enough to the ongoing project of human civilization that the Sumerians committed their most rigorous documentation tradition to preserving the record of what those traits were and how rarely they appeared. The question of rarity itself, why the traits are rare, and why they become progressively rarer as they ascend the scale, receives extended treatment in the tablets that most translations have not fully captured, because the explanation the scribes offer is embedded in a framework of Sumerian physics and cosmology that requires some unpacking. The Sumerians understood the cosmos as a structured system, governed by the me, the organizing principles with different domains of reality, arranged hierarchically according to the density and precision of the me that governed them. The Aeon, the heavenly realm, was governed by me of the highest precision and greatest organizing power. The Ki, the earthly realm, was governed by me of lower precision and greater variability. And the Anunnaki existed, in the Sumerian cosmology, as beings constituted by the highest precision me beings whose nature was an expression of the governing principles of the cosmos at their most concentrated form. When Anunnaki mixed with the human line, the result was a being that contained, in their genetic inheritance, both the high precision me of the Anunnaki and the lower precision me of the human line. The offspring of this crossing were not simply a blend. They were a population that expressed the high precision me variably, depending on which combination of variants they inherited from which parental contribution. The most common expression, the baseline Nephilim trait of Mila, required only a modest concentration of the high precision me to express, because Mila operates in a domain close to ordinary human social experience. Presence, authority, the quality of constitutional gravity that others register these require a relatively small elevation above the human baseline me to manifest distinctly. Hence, the relatively higher frequency of this trait in the Nephilim bloodline. As you ascend the rarity scale, each successive trait requires a higher concentration of the Anunnaki me to manifest, because each successive trait operates in a domain further from the ordinary human perceptual and constitutional baseline. Igigal Ninda Z, the broad perceptual sensitivity requires a somewhat higher concentration than Mila, because it involves the extension of ordinary sensory processing into domains that the human perceptual system does not naturally access. And Zag, the direct perception of the organizing principles, requires a still higher concentration because it involves a perceptual mode that is, in the Sumerian framework, constitutively Anunnaki rather than constitutively human. And so, on up the scale. The rarest traits, Saganamu, Tila Gig, and Udug Kalama require concentrations so high that they can only appear in individuals whose lineage contains an unusually high proportion of Anunnaki origin variants across the full range of relevant genome positions. These individuals are rare not because the traits are fragile or easily disrupted, but because the genetic conditions necessary to produce them are statistically uncommon. The more variants required to produce a threshold effect, and the higher the threshold, the rarer the individuals who exceed it. This is, again, exactly what modern population genetics would predict for polygenic threshold traits with large numbers of contributing variants. The mathematics of multivariant combinations means that extremely high expression levels, those requiring 10 or 20 or 30 simultaneous high-effect variants in the same genome, are exponentially rarer than moderate expression levels. The Sumerians did not know about genes or alleles or polygenic thresholds, but they observed the outcome of the mechanism the tablets describe, that the higher-ranked traits were not just somewhat rarer than the lower-ranked traits, but dramatically and progressively rarer, in a pattern consistent with each successive threshold requiring substantially higher concentrations of the originating lineage. The modern scientific community is not, on the whole, ready to engage with the Sumerian framework as seriously as this documentary has proposed. That is both understandable and unfortunate. It is understandable because the framework is embedded in ancient texts that the dominant interpretive tradition has spent more than a century reading as mythology, and because the content of the framework challenges fundamental assumptions about human origins and the uniqueness of the human evolutionary line that are deeply embedded in mainstream science's self-understanding. Paradigm shifts of this magnitude do not happen quickly or easily, and the resistance to them from within established disciplines is structurally inevitable. It is unfortunate because the evidence being left on the table, the correspondence between the tablet's descriptions and the modern literature on constitutional traits, the consistency of the rarity rankings with polygenic threshold mathematics, the cross-cultural documentation of all 7 traits in independent traditions, the ghost lineage signals in the modern human genome is too systematic to dismiss without serious engagement. The price of the dismissal is a continuing failure to understand a real population of real individuals with real, measurable, heritable constitutional characteristics that the current era is systematically misunderstanding. The misunderstanding has costs. The carrier of Ijigal Nindazi, who is diagnosed with sensory processing disorder and given management strategies rather than a developmental framework appropriate to their constitutional reality, is a cost. The carrier of an Zag, who is told their direct perception of organizing principles is spiritual bypassing and given meditation practices designed to suppress it, is a cost. The carrier of Namzushita, who is employed as a mid-level analyst and given no institutional support for the causal perception that, in a different framework, would make them invaluable to governance at the highest levels, is a cost. The carrier of Tilagig, who is exhausted, overwhelmed, and burning out in a healthcare environment that provides no protocol for managing the perceptual load of constitutional life force sensitivity, is a cost. These costs are real and ongoing. They fall on real people who are navigating their constitutional reality with inadequate tools in an inadequate framework. The Sumerian tablets provide, among other things, the framework that these individuals are missing. The recognition that what they carry is real, that it has been recognized before, that it has a name and a rarity ranking and a documented history of institutional management, and that the difficulty they experience is not personal failure but structural, the inevitable result of carrying a constitutional profile for which the current era has not built adequate institutional support. That recognition does not solve all the problems. It does not provide the training programs, the community structures, the institutional roles, the social acknowledgement that would allow these individuals to function at their full capacity rather than spending most of their energy managing a constitutional reality they have no framework for. But recognition is the beginning of every solution. The Sumerians began with recognition. They documented it with their characteristic precision, and they left the documentation available for the generations that would need it. The ethical dimension of this inquiry deserves direct address because it is one that the critics will raise, and they will be right to raise it. Any framework that identifies some individuals as constitutionally different from others, and specifically as carrying capacities that most people do not carry, carries the risk of being used to construct hierarchies. The history of the misuse of such frameworks, from scientific racism to eugenics to more recent pseudo-scientific claims about superior bloodlines, is not a minor concern. It is a catastrophic history of human harm, produced by taking observations about biological variation and embedding them in ideological frameworks that assign differential human worth. The Sumerian framework, taken seriously, is not immune to this risk. A rarity ranking of 7 traits, framed as markers of Anunnaki lineage, can be, and has been, in various alternative history and spiritual communities, appropriated into exactly the kind of hierarchy building that produces harm. The tablets themselves are, interestingly, a resource against this misuse. Because what the tablets document is not a hierarchy of human worth. They document a hierarchy of rarity of how frequently specific constitutional characteristics appear in the population. Rarity is not value. The rarest form of the human blood type is not the best blood type. The rarest architectural style in a historical period is not the superior style. And the rarest of the 7 Nephilim traits is not the most important, most valuable, or most worth possessing. What the tablets document is the full range of human constitutional variation, as the Sumerians understood it, with the rarity ranking serving as an administrative tool for identifying which individuals are likely to be available in sufficient numbers for various institutional roles. The Abgal Advisory Corps required carriers of Namzushita in sufficient numbers to staff the governance structures of multiple city-states. The Azu healing tradition required carriers of Telagig in sufficient numbers to maintain healing capacity across the civilization. The An tradition required carriers of Sagan Namu for the anchoring and interpretive roles that the governance structure needed. None of these roles was treated as superior to the others. They were different. They required different constitutional profiles, and the individuals who filled them were not ranked above other citizens of the civilization in terms of their fundamental worth or standing. They were recognized as carrying specific capacities that the civilization needed, and they were trained, supported, and institutionally housed in ways appropriate to those capacities. That is the framework the tablets actually provide, not hierarchy of worth, recognition of constitutional difference in the service of institutional function. The difference matters enormously, and it matters for how this information is used. Used correctly, the Sumerian framework provides a basis for recognizing, supporting, and productively integrating individuals who carry the 7 traits without placing them above others, without assigning them superior worth, and without constructing ideological hierarchies that harm both them and everyone else. Used incorrectly, it becomes another tool for the same misuse that has characterized so many previous encounters with the fact of human biological diversity. The Sumerians would have understood this distinction perfectly. Their administrative tradition was built on the precise identification of constitutional differences in the service of institutional function, not on ranking human beings by intrinsic worth. The me were not evaluations, they were inventories. They told the administrator what each individual could contribute to the collective project of civilization, not what each individual was worth as a person. That is the reading this inquiry intends, and it is the only reading of the Sumerian documentation that honors both its content and the ethical responsibilities of those who engage with it. The tablets are also, in a sense, a gift of method, because what the Sumerian scribes demonstrated in their documentation of the 7 traits is not just the content of what they observed, but the way they observed it. They brought the same methodological standards to the question of human constitutional diversity that they brought to every other domain of their administrative and intellectual life. They did not exceptionalize the question. They did not treat it as too sacred or too dangerous or too politically sensitive to examine with rigor. They examined it with exactly the rigor it required, and they left the results in a form designed to survive across the full length of their civilization. The method is the message, in some respects. Because the method says, these things are real enough to be examined carefully. These people are real enough to be documented precisely. This question of what human beings actually are, of the full range of what human constitutional diversity includes, of what it means to carry within your body the traces of an encounter between the human line and something that came before it or alongside it or from beyond it. This question is serious enough to bring your best intellectual tools to bear on it. The 7 traits, ranked by their rarity. The 7 markers that the Sumerians believed distinguished individuals carrying the highest concentrations of the Anunnaki lineage from the general human population, documented with precision, preserved in clay, waiting, across 4,000 years, for the era that had both the scientific tools to evaluate them and the intellectual courage to try. That era, whatever else it is, may be this one. What remains, after everything this documentary has covered, is not a conclusion in the ordinary sense. A conclusion would close the inquiry. What the Sumerian framework opens is the opposite of a closing. It opens a set of questions that the available evidence cannot yet fully answer, and it provides a framework for pursuing those questions with the seriousness and rigor they deserve. The questions about human origins, the questions about constitutional diversity, the questions about the institutional structures adequate to the full range of human constitutional reality, the questions about what it means to carry, in the cells of a contemporary human body, the traces of an encounter that the oldest written civilization in the world believed was the most important event in the history of the species. Those questions were always there. The Sumerians did not invent them. They found them already present in the observable reality of the human population around them, and they did what the best minds of their civilization always did. They wrote it down. 7 traits, ranked by the civilization that documented them, according to how rarely they appear. In ascending order of rarity, the radiance of executive presence that others perceive, without being able to name it. The perceptual sensitivity that receives a broader data stream than the standard human sensory system. The direct perception of the organizing principles of reality as a constitutive feature of experience. The constitutional access to causal structure beneath observable phenomena. The identity rooted in the original Anunnaki designation, rather than in the accumulated social self. The constitutional intimacy with the life force of other living beings. And at the peak, the full expression of what the Sumerians understood as the Anunnaki light present in a human body without remainder and without mediation. The question that should be asked at this point, if this inquiry has been conducted honestly, is, what do we do with this? Not, what do we do with it, in the sense of exploiting it or commercializing it or building identity frameworks around it that serve psychological needs rather than factual investigation. That kind of appropriation is what happens to every genuinely important discovery, and it is exactly what the Sumerian scribes seemed to anticipate when they embedded their documentation in administrative texts rather than in the literary and religious formats that were more likely to be elaborated beyond. Recognition. What do we do with it in the sense of, given that this framework exists, given that it is internally consistent, given that it generates testable predictions that the available evidence supports, given that the traits it describes are real and measurable and heritable, what is the responsible intellectual and ethical response? The responsible response is the same one that the Sumerians modeled. Precision without mystification, acknowledgement without exceptionalization, recognition without hierarchy. The traits they documented are not markers of spiritual election. They are not evidence that some people are more valuable than others, or more deserving, or more cosmically significant. They are evidence that the human lineage is more complex than the standard account of human origins describes, and that some of the traits produced by that complexity are both real and consequential. That evidence should be incorporated into the way we understand human diversity, not as a new hierarchy to replace the old ones, but as a correction to the assumption of fundamental uniformity that has led the mainstream account of human biology and psychology to treat genuine constitutional differences as noise, as pathology, or as mysticism rather than as what they are, variations in the human phenotype that trace to unusual inputs in the human lineage. The practical implications of the Sumerian framework, if taken seriously, are substantial and specific. There is also a meta-level implication worth acknowledging before we reach the practical specifics. The existence of this framework, the fact that a civilization this sophisticated, this committed to empirical documentation across every domain of its intellectual life, chose to apply those same standards to the question of human constitutional diversity is itself evidence that the question is real, not that the Sumerian answers are definitively correct. That the question deserves the quality of attention the Sumerians gave it. A civilization that built the first cities, the first legal codes, and the first mathematical records did not waste its best documentation practices on fabrications. What they spent their rigor on was real. For the individuals who carry one or more of the 7 traits, the framework provides what no modern framework adequately provides: a description of what is actually happening. The carrier of Milah, who has spent their life wondering why rooms reorganize around them without instruction now, has a vocabulary for the constitutional reality they have always inhabited. The carrier of Igigal Nindazi, who has spent decades believing that their perceptual sensitivity is a pathology to be managed rather than a constitutional capacity to be developed, now has a historical record of civilizations that recognized it as an asset and built institutional structures to support it. The carrier of Anzag, who has lived their entire life at the interface between the organizing principles of reality and the surface world that most people take as the whole story, now has an ancient name for the perceptual position they occupy. Names matter, not because they change the underlying reality, but because they provide the cognitive scaffolding within which experience can be understood, developed, and communicated. The Sumerians knew this. The entire me system was a taxonomy of constitutive capacities, and the act of naming those capacities was understood not as labeling them for bureaucratic convenience, but as making them available for conscious engagement. The me you can name is the me you can work with deliberately, rather than simply being subject to, as a force that operates on you without your understanding. For the individuals who carry the higher-ranked traits, and who have been navigating their experience without any framework adequate to describe it, the Sumerian taxonomy is not a final answer. It is a beginning, a way of recognizing that the experience is real, that it has been recognized before, that other people have carried it and documented it and built institutional structures to support it, and that the absence of those institutional structures in the current era is a contingent historical fact rather than a permanent feature of what it means to carry these traits in a human body. The reconstruction of those institutional structures in forms appropriate to the current era, built on the best available scientific understanding of the traits, designed to serve both the carriers and the communities that would benefit from what the carriers can offer, is a project that the Sumerian tablets implicitly call for, not as a religious or cultural revival, as a practical institutional response to a real human phenomenon that the current era has failed to adequately address. The critics of everything we have covered in this documentary will raise legitimate objections. They should. The framework advanced here is not established science. Several of the specific claims made in the course of tracing the 7 traits are hypotheses rather than established facts. The connection between the Sumerian account of Anunnaki hybridization and the modern genetic evidence for ghost lineages in the human genome is suggestive rather than demonstrated. The neurological underpinnings of the higher-ranked traits are partially described in the modern literature but not fully characterized. The frequency estimates embedded in the tablets cannot be independently verified. These are real limitations, and they should be acknowledged with the same precision that the Sumerian scribes applied to their own documentation. The Sumerian scribes, for all their rigor, were also working within an explanatory framework, the Anunnaki governance framework that incorporated cosmological and metaphysical assumptions that cannot be directly verified from the documentary evidence. They were doing what every sophisticated empirical tradition does, making their best observations within the best available explanatory framework, acknowledging the constraints, and leaving the documentation available for subsequent refinement. We are in the subsequent refinement period. The documentary record they left is being read with tools they did not have: modern genetics, neuroimaging, population biology, comparative mythology. When those tools are applied to the record they left, the results are not what you would expect if the record were mythology. The results are what you would expect if the record were ethnographic documentation of real phenomena by a sophisticated observational tradition with limited explanatory frameworks but rigorous observational discipline. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, exactly how the history of science proceeds. The Greeks observed the sky with extraordinary precision and built astronomical models that were wrong in their explanatory framework but right in their observations. Modern astronomy did not discard the Greek observations because the epicycles were wrong. It used the observations to develop better models. The Sumerian documentation of the 7 Nephilim traits is in the same position. The explanatory framework may require substantial revision. The observations are real. What the Sumerians were doing, at the deepest level, was something that every genuinely sophisticated civilization attempts and most fail to sustain. They were maintaining careful attention to the full range of what human beings can be, not just the average, not just the typical, not just the modes and medians of the human phenotypic distribution, the entire range, including the far ends of the distribution that most civilizations, most of the time, fail to adequately accommodate. The 7 traits they documented represent the far end of a range of human constitutional variation that exists today, that has always existed, that produces individuals who are in some respects constitutionally different from the majority of human beings, and that has been systematically miscategorized throughout the modern era, as pathology, as spirituality, as exceptional charisma, as talent, as genius, anything but what it actually is. The constitutional expression of a lineage that entered the human gene pool through an encounter that the Sumerians believed they had documented. Whether that encounter was with the Anunnaki, as the tablets described them, non-human beings who arrived on Earth with advanced technology and administrative capacity and created the human species as a hybrid workforce, or with an undocumented, archaic hominid population as modern genetics might prefer to frame it, or with something for which neither vocabulary is currently adequate, is a question that remains genuinely open. The tablets do not resolve it for us. They document the encounter as they understood it, and they leave the evaluation of that understanding to the generations that follow. We are those generations. We have tools the Sumerians did not have, and we have the Sumerians' tools, their documented observations, their classification systems, their frequency estimates, their institutional responses that they left for us with the care of people who understood that what they were documenting was important enough to preserve across the full span of their civilization. The 7 traits are preserved. The ranking by rarity is preserved. The institutional wisdom about how to recognize, accommodate, and productively integrate the people who carry them is partially preserved, in fragments and approximations, in the scattered documentary record of the tradition they founded. The work of reconstruction belongs to this era, and the first step of reconstruction is exactly what the Sumerians modeled: careful observation, precise documentation, and the intellectual courage to name what is actually there, rather than the version of it that the dominant framework finds comfortable. 7 traits, ranked by rarity, documented by the civilization that first wrote it all down. The names have been waiting for 4,000 years for someone to read them carefully. The question the tablets leave open, and the question that this documentary has been building toward from its first sentence, is whether the generation that reads them carefully is the one that can also act on what they find. The Sumerians believed that such a generation would come. They believed it enough to commit the documentation to clay. Clay that survived floods, invasions, the collapse of their civilization, and 3,000 years of burial, to arrive in the archives and translation projects where this inquiry draws on it today. They were not writing for themselves. They were writing for a moment when the tools to read the documentation properly existed, when the scientific frameworks to evaluate the claims had developed far enough to engage them rigorously, and when the individuals who carry the traits they documented were numerous enough and connected enough to need a framework that honored what they carry. That moment may be now. The tablets suggest it is. The processional mathematics suggest it is. The proliferation, in the current era, of individuals seeking frameworks for constitutional experiences that the standard cultural vocabulary cannot accommodate suggests it is. Whether it is or not, the documentation is available. The 7 traits are named. The rarity ranking is established. The institutional wisdom is partially preserved. The rest is yours to carry forward.